Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The heat in Nevada can make you do stupid things. And maybe that's my excuse for ignoring every warning I got that Saturday in early September. I'd been driving through the desert for weeks, documenting ghost towns for my dissertation on economic collapse in mining communities. And honestly, after visiting 12 settlements that were nothing but foundation stones and rusty nails, I was getting desperate for something substantial. The old-timer at the gas station in Searchlight kept wiping the same spot on the counter while he talked, his eyes never quite meeting mine, telling me about this place 40 miles northwest that nobody visits anymore. Not since the flooding in the mine back in '78, he said. Not since those families disappeared. But I needed this. My advisor had already rejected 2 thesis proposals, and turning 31 while still chasing a PhD was starting to feel like running in quicksand. The road out there wasn't on any map I had, just a dirt track that branched off the highway near mile marker 47. Exactly where the gas station owner said it would be. My Subaru kicked up dust clouds that hung in the rearview mirror like ghosts, and after 20 minutes of washboard roads that rattled my teeth, I saw the first structures rising from the desert floor. There were maybe 15 buildings still standing, their wood bleached white as bones, windows nothing but dark squares that seemed to watch my approach. I parked near what looked like the old general store, its sign hanging by one chain, creaking in the wind even though I couldn't feel any breeze. The silence hit me first, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my camera and notebook, telling myself the unease crawling up my spine was just excitement about finally finding an intact site. The first thing that didn't make sense was the footprints, fresh ones, maybe a day old at most, leading from behind the general store toward a cluster of collapsed shacks near the mine entrance. I followed them, my boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt, and that's when I noticed the trailer. It sat between 2 fallen buildings like someone had deliberately hidden it there. Aluminum siding still shiny under layers of dust. Definitely not from the mining era. A heavy padlock secured the door, the kind you'd buy at Home Depot, not some antique rusted thing. I was photographing it when I heard the music, faint, tinny, like an old radio playing from somewhere inside. My hand hesitated on the door handle, and I pressed my ear against the warm metal. Definitely music, some country song I didn't recognize, barely audible, but unmistakably there. I should have left right then, should have driven straight back to Searchlight and deleted the photos, forgotten the whole place existed. But I kept thinking about my thesis, about the rejection letters, about spending another year waiting tables while my college friends were buying houses and having kids. So I walked deeper into the settlement, documenting everything with my camera, taking notes on the unusual preservation of certain structures. The sun was getting lower, painting long shadows across the desert floor, and I found myself at the mine entrance, a gaping mouth in the hillside, reinforced with timber that looked surprisingly solid. More footprints led inside, lots of them, different shoe sizes, some going in, some coming out. The air flowing from the mine felt cooler, carrying a smell like motor oil and something else, something organic that made me step back instinctively. That's when I saw the generator. It was tucked behind a pile of rotting lumber near the mine entrance, a yellow Caterpillar model, industrial-sized with fresh fuel cans stacked beside it. The thing wasn't running, but when I touched the engine block, warmth still radiated from the metal. Someone had used it recently, maybe within the last few hours. My phone showed 5:47 p.m., and I realized I'd been there longer than planned, the desert already turning that deep orange that comes before dark. I started walking back toward my car, faster now, when I noticed something else that made me stop cold. Tire tracks, fresh ones, multiple sets, crisscrossing the main path through town. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it because I'd specifically photographed that area for its undisturbed sand patterns. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe locals used this place for parties, or perhaps someone was salvaging metal from the ruins. But those explanations crumbled when I reached my car and found a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, expecting maybe a warning from local teenagers or a note from another researcher. Instead, there was a single line written in pencil. You need to leave before they count the inventory. No signature, nothing else. Just those 8 words that made absolutely no sense but somehow felt like the most important message I'd ever received. I looked around the empty settlement, at the shadows growing longer between buildings, and for the first time, noticed how many corners and doorways could hide someone watching. I threw my gear in the back seat and fumbled for my keys, every instinct screaming at me to get out now. The engine turned over on the 3rd try and I was reversing when I saw them. 3 sets of headlights in the distance, maybe 2 miles out, bouncing along the access road toward the settlement. They were moving fast, too fast for casual visitors or lost tourists, and they were definitely coming this way. There was nowhere else that road led. I slammed the car into drive and headed for the exit, but as I passed the trailer with the music, the door was open. Wide open, padlock hanging loose, and I could see inside for just a second as my headlights swept past. Rows of shelving, like a pharmacy, filled with labeled containers, and in the back, several people sitting very still on benches, their faces turned away from the light. My Subaru fishtailed as I hit the dirt road too fast, dust clouding everything behind me. Those headlights were gaining, eating up the distance between us like they knew exactly where I was going. I called my roommate, needed to tell someone where I was in case. The call connected and I started talking fast, giving her the location, describing the turnoff at mile marker 47, but the signal cut out mid-sentence just as I was explaining about the trailer. No bars, no service, nothing. The phone was completely dead even though I'd charged it that morning. In the rearview mirror, the headlights had spread out, one staying behind me while the other 2 disappeared onto parallel paths I hadn't even known existed. They were trying to box me in, and I realized with perfect, terrifying clarity that they knew this desert better than I ever would. The main road was still 10 minutes away, but suddenly there were headlights in front of me too, coming from a side trail that materialized out of the darkness. I yanked the wheel hard left, leaving the road entirely, praying the Subaru could handle the raw desert terrain. The car bucked and pitched over rocks and scrub brush, my teeth clacking together with each impact, the steering wheel trying to tear itself from my grip. Behind me, 2 of the vehicles followed while the 3rd stayed on the road, probably waiting for me to circle back. These weren't random locals or scavengers. They moved with coordination, purpose, like they'd done this before. My headlights caught a flash of an old wooden sign barely visible in the sagebrush. Grayson Mine Shaft 3. Danger, keep out. Without thinking, I drove straight toward it, hoping maybe the old mining roads would give me an advantage. The shaft entrance loomed in my headlights, a timber-framed hole cut into a low hill, and I saw my only chance. There was a dirt path running alongside it, probably an old maintenance road, narrow but passable. I killed my headlights and engine simultaneously, letting momentum carry me into the deeper shadows beside the mine entrance. The Subaru rolled to a stop behind a pile of rusted mining equipment, and I held my breath, watching through the rear window as the pursuing headlights swept past, then stopped, then started backing up. They'd lost me for a moment, but not for long. I could hear doors slamming, voices calling out to each other in the darkness, organized and calm like they were conducting a routine search. One of them had a flashlight, one of those powerful spotlights that turned night into day, and it was sweeping methodically through the area where I'd left the road. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying with the car, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the passenger door, staying low, moving toward the mine entrance. The shaft went back about 30 feet before hitting a collapse, but there was a side passage, partially hidden behind fallen timbers. I squeezed through, the space so tight my shoulders scraped both walls, and found myself in a slightly wider chamber. Old tools hung on the walls, pickaxes, shovels, things that hadn't been touched in decades, and there was another narrow passage leading deeper. I could hear them outside getting closer, one voice saying they found fresh tire tracks leading toward the mine. The spotlight beam swept across the entrance and I pressed myself deeper into the passage, feeling my way in complete darkness. my breathing so loud I was sure they'd hear it echoing off the stone walls. I stayed in that mine for 6 hours, moving deeper whenever I heard them getting close, navigating by touch through passages that seemed to connect in a maze of tunnels. Around midnight, the sounds finally stopped, but I waited another 2 hours before creeping back toward the entrance. My car was gone, not a trace of it anywhere, like it had never existed. I had to walk 8 miles through the desert to reach the highway, hiding whenever headlights appeared, finally flagging down a truck driver at dawn who took me back to Searchlight. When I reported everything to the police, they found my Subaru 3 days later, hidden under a brown tarp in one of the mine shafts 2 miles from where I'd abandoned it. The engine was still warm, they said, even though it had been missing for days. The trailer was gone, the footprints were gone, even the generator had vanished. The only thing they found was my camera sitting on the driver's seat, all the photos deleted except one, a picture I didn't take, showing the inside of that trailer, rows and rows of people sitting on benches, all of them looking directly at the camera with the same empty expression. The Mojave stretched out in front of me like an endless ocean of dust and Joshua trees, and I remember thinking how perfect the light was that October morning. I'd been chasing desert kit foxes for 3 weeks straight, sleeping in my truck and living off granola bars and bottled water. The kind of solitary work that made my editor at National Geographic question my sanity every time we talked on the satellite phone. My divorce had finalized 6 months earlier, right after my 37th birthday, and throwing myself into documenting endangered species seemed healthier than sitting in my empty apartment in Phoenix. The assignment was simple enough: capture behavioral footage of the foxes during their breeding season, something that hadn't been properly documented in over a decade. I'd already gotten some decent shots near Kelso Dunes, but I wanted something special, something that would make the magazine's front cover and remind everyone why I used to win awards before my life fell apart. I turned off the main highway about an hour earlier, following a Forest Service map that promised an old mining road leading to untouched habitat. The dirt track was rougher than expected, full of washouts from last winter's flash floods, and my pickup crawled along at maybe 10 miles per hour, while dust devils danced across the barren landscape. That's when I spotted the van, maybe a quarter mile ahead, parked sideways across the narrow road like someone had tried to turn around but gave up halfway through. Both doors hung open like broken wings, and even from a distance I could see camping gear scattered on the ground. A blue sleeping bag unrolled in the dirt, a Coleman stove tipped on its side, plastic water bottles reflecting the morning sun. My first thought was some city folks had gotten lost, maybe ran out of gas or got spooked by the isolation, because you'd be amazed how many people underestimate the desert and end up needing rescue. I pulled up about 20 feet behind the van and killed my engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of driving. The vehicle was a white Ford Econoline, probably from the early 2000s, with Arizona plates covered in so much dust I had to squint to read the numbers. No sounds came from inside, no movement except for a piece of paper fluttering on the driver's seat, held down by what looked like a thermos. I called out a greeting, then another louder one, but my voice just disappeared into the vastness around us. The smart thing would have been to radio the situation in and keep driving, but the scattered gear bothered me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Everything looked too deliberate, too organized despite the chaos, like someone had carefully arranged their belongings before walking away. The sleeping bag wasn't just dropped, but unrolled perfectly straight, the water bottles lined up in a row beside it, and when I walked closer, I noticed a digital camera on a tripod pointing toward the horizon, its red recording light still blinking steadily. The inside of the van hit me with a wave of stale air, and something else. Something metallic and wrong that made me breathe through my mouth. The front seats were covered in manila folders, loose papers, and what looked like printouts from missing persons websites. Faces of young women and men staring up at me with hopeful smiles from happier times. But it was the document on the driver's seat that stopped me cold. A half-completed police report form from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, dated just 3 days ago. The officer's name at the top read, Deputy James Holbrook, badge number 4827, and the incident type was listed as Suspicious Activity Investigation. Most of the form was blank, but under the preliminary notes section, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "Multiple subjects confirmed at coordinates. Appears to be underground storage. Requesting immediate backup before proceeding." Below that, a topographical map of the area was spread out, marked with red X's at various points, and a dark brown stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood had soaked through one corner, obscuring part of the legend. My satellite phone was back in the truck, and every instinct told me to grab it and call for help immediately. But those red marks on the map, they weren't random. One of them matched exactly where I was standing, and another marked a spot about 2 miles north, near what the map labeled as Coyote Dry Lake. The bloodstain covered a third mark, but I could make out enough to see it was near an abandoned borax mine I'd passed yesterday. What really made my pulse quicken were the photographs paper-clipped to the folders. Surveillance-style shots of different vehicles parked at gas stations, rest stops, and campgrounds throughout the region. Each photo had a date and timestamp in the corner, some going back months, and I recognized a few of the locations from my own travels through the area. One folder was labeled Pattern Analysis in neat handwriting, completely different from the shaky scrawl on the police report, and inside were charts tracking disappearances by date, location, and victim profile, all centered around a 50-mile radius of where I now stood. The rationalization started immediately, that comforting voice in your head that tries to explain away the obvious horror. Maybe Holbrook was an off-duty cop doing his own investigation. Maybe he was a private investigator hired by desperate families. Maybe the blood was from a nosebleed or a cut hand. But then I found the deputy's badge under the passenger seat, along with his service weapon, a Glock 22 with a full magazine. And nobody, absolutely nobody in law enforcement leaves those things behind voluntarily. The radio mounted on the dashboard was smashed, wires hanging loose like exposed nerves, and when I looked closer at the driver's seat, I could see fingernail marks gouged deep into the fabric, as if someone had been dragged out while fighting to stay inside. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold but the battery still working, which meant the van hadn't been here more than a day or two at most. Through the back windows, I could see more equipment: zip ties, rope, a shovel, heavy-duty trash bags, and a handheld GPS unit still showing the last searched coordinates, which pointed directly to the dry lake bed marked on the bloody map. I should have left right then, should have driven straight back to civilization and let the authorities handle whatever nightmare was unfolding in this forgotten corner of the desert. But those faces in the missing persons reports kept staring at me, and one of them, a young woman named Kayla Brennan from Flagstaff, had disappeared just last week according to the printout. Her parents were offering a $50,000 reward, and in her photo she wore a turquoise necklace, identical to one I'd seen glinting in the dirt near the van's rear tire. The GPS coordinates on that handheld unit were only 2 miles away, and if there was even a chance someone was still alive out there, if Deputy Holbrook had found something before whatever happened to him, then I couldn't just drive away. I grabbed the Glock, checking the chamber and safety like my ex-military brother had taught me years ago, tucked the GPS unit in my pocket along with my satellite phone, and started walking north toward the coordinates, telling myself I'd just look from a distance, just confirm what was there before calling for help. The desert heat was already climbing toward unbearable as I followed a narrow wash that led toward the dry lake, my photographer's eye automatically noting how the morning shadows played across the ancient rocks and scattered bones of long-dead animals. Every few hundred yards I found more evidence that someone had been through here recently: fresh boot prints in the sandy patches, a crushed energy drink can that hadn't been there long enough to fade in the sun, and strangest of all, small fluorescent orange flags stuck in the ground at regular intervals, like someone was marking a trail. The GPS showed I was getting closer to the coordinates, and through my telephoto lens, I could make out what looked like a cluster of old shipping containers near the edge of the lake bed, their rust-colored surfaces almost invisible against the surrounding rocks. But it was the smell that hit me first, carried on the light breeze, a sweet, sick odor that anyone who's spent time in war zones or disaster areas recognizes immediately. Death has a very particular scent in the desert, where the dry air mummifies rather than decomposes, and this wasn't the smell of one body, but several, mixed with something chemical and sharp that burned the inside of my nostrils. The shipping containers were arranged in a rough semicircle, partially buried in the alkali soil of the dried lake, and someone had welded them together with steel plates to create one continuous structure. Heavy chains and industrial padlocks secured the doors, but one container at the far end stood open, its entrance a black rectangle that seemed to swallow the morning light. Fresh tire tracks led right up to it, multiple sets overlapping, and scattered around were more personal items. A woman's sneaker, a baseball cap with a University of Arizona logo, a wallet splayed open in the dirt with credit cards spilling out. I recognized Deputy Holbrook's handwriting on a notepad near the entrance, pages flapping in the wind, documenting license plate numbers, dates, and what looked like delivery schedules for something called Project Coyote. The last entry, written in increasingly erratic script, simply read, "They know I'm here, can hear the trucks coming back. If anyone finds this, the main site is 5 miles northeast, Old Garrison Mine. They've been using it since 2018. At least 30 missing. Still alive underground. Tell my wife." The sentence ended mid-word, the pen mark dragging off the page in a long, desperate line. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the weight of the Glock suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever operation was happening here. Through the open container door, I could see industrial shelving stocked with medical supplies, IV bags, restraints, and dozens of those blue pharmaceutical coolers that hospitals use for organ transport. A generator hummed somewhere inside, keeping refrigeration units running, and a work table near the entrance held surgical instruments laid out on sterile cloth, recently used and waiting to be cleaned. The realization of what this place was, what someone was doing out here in the middle of nowhere, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just murder or kidnapping. This was something systematically worse, something that required infrastructure and planning and multiple people working together. The sound of an engine in the distance snapped me back to immediate danger, dust rising maybe 2 miles away and heading directly toward the containers, moving fast across the desert floor in a way that suggested whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Running back through the desert felt like one of those nightmares where your legs won't work properly, the soft sand grabbing at my boots while the sound of engines grew louder behind me. I made it to my truck and immediately called 911 on the satellite phone, but the connection was terrible, cutting in and out as I tried to explain what I'd found. The dispatcher kept asking me to repeat my location, and I was screaming the GPS coordinates when I saw 2 vehicles crest a ridge behind me, modified pickup trucks with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows. I threw the truck in drive and floored it, the rear wheels spinning before catching traction, and started the most terrifying drive of my life back toward the main highway. They followed for about 10 miles, staying just close enough to let me know they were there before suddenly stopping at what must have been some predetermined boundary. I didn't stop driving until I reached a highway patrol station in Barstow, where I spent the next 6 hours giving statements, looking at photos, and watching the disbelief on officers' faces slowly turn to alarm as they verified parts of my story. The raid on the containers happened that night, a joint operation between FBI, ATF, and local law enforcement that made national news for about 3 days before being buried under other headlines. They found the remains of 14 people in various states of decomposition, the underground facility at Garrison Mine that Holbrook had mentioned, and enough evidence to arrest 7 individuals connected to what investigators called a medical trafficking ring. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. They never found Deputy James Holbrook, dead or alive, and 23 people from those missing persons files remain unaccounted for. The prosecutor said the ring had been operating for at least 6 years, targeting travelers and drifters, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarms. I testified at the trial, showed my photographs, and watched as 3 doctors, 2 EMTs, and 2 men identified only as logistics coordinators received life sentences. But during the trial, one of the defendants smiled at me from across the courtroom and mouthed the words, "There are others," and I knew he wasn't lying. I still photograph wildlife, but I don't work alone in remote areas anymore. And every time I see an abandoned vehicle on a desert road, I keep driving and call it in from a safe distance, because some things in the desert are meant to stay hidden, and some horrors are all too human. Friday afternoon in early August changed everything about how I see the desert around Alamogordo. I run a small electronics repair shop downtown, and when Detective Vasquez walked through my door carrying a damaged phone in an evidence bag, I figured it would be just another data recovery job for the police department. He was a stocky guy with graying temples who explained they needed help accessing the contents of a phone belonging to a missing person. According to the report he placed on my counter, Natalie Dunn had just turned 26 in July, making her 2 years younger than me. She'd driven out here alone from Ohio to film content for her travel channel, one of those YouTube ventures where people document their solo adventures in remote places. Her parents had called the authorities after she failed to check in for 3 days straight, and search teams found her silver Subaru Outback abandoned on a dirt road about 15 miles from the main highway, locked from the inside with all her camping gear still packed neatly in the trunk. My fingers worked carefully around the spider-webbed glass as I connected the phone to my recovery equipment. When I finally bypassed the damaged screen and pulled up her GPS history, the data showed something that made both Detective Vasquez and me exchange worried glances. Her last recorded location was about 20 miles from where they found the car, deep inside what I immediately recognized as military-restricted territory near the missile range. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. on the night she disappeared, and after that, absolute nothing. Just that single frozen coordinate pulsing on my monitor, like a digital beacon in the middle of nowhere. Detective Vasquez leaned closer, his coffee breath filling the space between us, and asked if I could recover any photos or videos from that day. Natalie had filmed everything, apparently planning to edit it all into a vlog episode about desert camping. And as the video files began loading one by one, we found ourselves watching them right there in my shop, instead of just transferring them to the evidence drive like we should have. Her first video that morning showed her standing beside her Subaru at a gas station, huge sunglasses reflecting the early sunshine while she held her camera at arm's length. She had this infectious energy, talking about how she'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to capture the real desert experience away from tourist spots. Natalie explained she'd researched lesser-known areas around White Sands, spots where she could get dramatic footage without crowds of people in the background. She showed her supplies: 5 gallons of water, enough food for 3 days, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a bright orange tent she joked would be visible from space. What struck me was how prepared she seemed, checking off items from a laminated list while narrating her safety protocols. She even mentioned telling her parents her exact route and that she'd check in every evening at 8. The detective paused the video to make notes, and I noticed his pen hovering when she mentioned she'd hired a local guide named Carson to show her some photography spots, though she planned to camp alone. Video number 2 started around noon with the camera mounted on her dashboard, capturing the endless stretch of desert highway while she sang along to some pop song I didn't recognize. She pulled over several times to film the landscape, each shot showing her getting more excited about the isolation and beauty of the area. At one point, she stood on a rock formation and slowly panned the camera in a complete circle, showing nothing but desert scrub and distant mountains in every direction. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said to the camera, her voice filled with genuine awe. No cell towers, no buildings, just pure wilderness. Around the 4th hour of driving footage, she met up with Carson at a crossroads, a lanky guy in his 40s wearing a weathered cowboy hat who pointed out various directions on her map, his finger tracing roads that weren't on any GPS. Detective Vasquez asked me to zoom in on the map, but the video quality made it impossible to read the markings clearly. After Carson left, Natalie continued alone, following what looked like a barely visible dirt track that wound between clusters of yucca plants and Joshua trees. By late afternoon in her videos, the landscape had transformed into something almost alien. She'd reached an area where the sand had this strange grayish-white color, and she kept stopping to film herself sifting it through her fingers, marveling at how fine it was compared to regular sand. The sun was getting lower, casting these long, dramatic shadows that she used for artistic shots of her footprints disappearing into the distance. Around 6 p.m., she found what she called the perfect spot, a flat area surrounded by low hills that would block the wind but still give her a view of the stars. She set up her orange tent with practiced efficiency, narrating each step for her future viewers, explaining how to properly stake down a tent in loose sand, and why she'd chosen this particular model for desert camping. While she worked, she kept glancing at something behind the camera and at one point said, "That's weird, I didn't see those earlier." But the camera was facing her tent, so we couldn't see what she meant. Detective Vasquez rewound that part 3 times, and we both noticed how her cheerful demeanor had shifted slightly, though she quickly went back to her upbeat narration. Her sunset footage was genuinely beautiful, the desert bathed in gold and purple light while she cooked freeze-dried pasta on her portable stove. She'd positioned the camera on a tripod to film herself preparing dinner, talking about how peaceful everything was, how the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. But around 7:30 p.m., something changed in the videos. She kept turning to look behind her, and twice she stood up suddenly and walked out of frame for several minutes, leaving the camera running on an empty camp chair. When she came back the second time, she forced a laugh and said the desert was playing tricks on her eyes, making her think she saw lights where there couldn't possibly be any. She tried to maintain her vlogger personality, but her voice had this strained quality, and she kept losing her train of thought mid-sentence. At exactly 8 p.m., she made her check-in call on the satellite phone, and we could hear her telling her parents everything was fine, that she was having an amazing time. But after she hung up, she sat there staring at the phone for a full minute before whispering to the camera, "I need to move the car." The next video clip started with the camera shaking wildly as she hurried back to her Subaru in the growing darkness. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, and she kept muttering things like, "This isn't right," and "They shouldn't be here." When she reached the car, she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice in the sand before managing to unlock the door. She threw the camera onto the passenger seat, and for a few seconds all we could see was the ceiling light and her arm reaching for the ignition. The engine turned over but didn't start. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, and this time it roared to life. But then she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, and in the dim light from the dashboard, we could see tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave the tent," she said to nobody in particular. "All my stuff is there. They'll know I was here." She wiped her face with her sleeve and grabbed the camera again, and what she said next made Detective Vasquez pause the video to call his supervisor. "If something happens to me," Natalie said, looking directly into the lens. "Carson knew about this place. He kept asking questions about whether I'd be alone, and he marked something on my map that I didn't ask for. I think he sent them here." Detective Vasquez left to make his calls while I continued watching the videos, and what I saw next still gives me nightmares. Natalie had driven her car about a mile from her campsite, parking it behind a large rock formation, then walked back to her tent with just the camera and a flashlight. The footage was jerky and chaotic, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the desert floor, creating monstrous shadows from every small bush and rock. When she reached her campsite, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her tent was exactly as she'd left it, but there were tire tracks circling it, deep grooves in the sand from what looked like multiple vehicles. She approached slowly, camera held high, and that's when we heard it. Men's voices, at least 3 different ones, coming from somewhere beyond the range of her flashlight. They were speaking in low tones, but one phrase came through clearly. She couldn't have gone far on foot. Natalie immediately switched off her flashlight, and the camera's night vision kicked in, showing her crouched behind her tent in that eerie green glow. She was trying to control her breathing, but small whimpers kept escaping. The voices were getting closer, and we could hear footsteps crunching through the sand, along with the metallic clink of what sounded like tools or weapons. For about 10 minutes, the video showed nothing but darkness and the sound of Natalie's terrified breathing. Occasionally, Flashlight beams would sweep across the area above her head, and she'd press herself lower into the sand. Then came a moment that made me physically sick to watch. One of the men walked right past her tent, so close that his boots were visible in the frame for a few seconds. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and what looked like night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead. "She's got to be around here somewhere," he called out to the others. "Check if she doubled back to the rocks." Another voice, older and gravelly, responded from further away. "Told Carson this was too public. Should have waited until she was further into the restricted zone." They continued searching, their lights crisscrossing the desert. And at one point, two of them stood directly in front of her tent, discussing whether to slash it open to check inside. Natalie had buried her face in the sand to muffle her breathing, and the camera caught her whole body trembling violently. They eventually moved away, but not before one of them said something that explained everything. "Radio says the test is still scheduled for midnight. We need to find her and get out before then." What happened next was pure chaos captured in fragments of shaky footage. Natalie tried to crawl away from the campsite on her belly, dragging herself through the sand with the camera clutched in one hand. But about 50 yards out, a spotlight suddenly blazed to life, catching her in its beam. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the camera recording wild glimpses of ground and sky as men shouted behind her. We could hear engines starting and the sound of vehicles pursuing her across the desert. She ran toward what she must have thought was the direction of her hidden car, but in the darkness and panic, she'd gotten turned around. The last coherent video showed her stumbling down into a ravine, losing her footing on the loose sand and tumbling down the slope. The camera flew from her hand and landed several feet away, still recording. In the frame, we could see her lying motionless at the bottom for a few seconds, before she slowly pushed herself up and looked around frantically for the camera. Her face was covered in sand and blood from a cut on her forehead, and her eyes had this wild, desperate look. She grabbed the camera and whispered, "They're herding me toward the test area. They want it to look like an accident." Then she turned it off, and the next file was from her phone, just audio, recorded at 11:43 p.m. The audio file was 4 minutes of pure terror, heavy breathing, stumbling footsteps, and Natalie's voice barely above a whisper, trying to leave a final record. "I found a drainage pipe under the fence," she gasped. "Made it through to the other side, but I think this is the restricted area Carson marked. There's these concrete structures everywhere, old bunkers or something." In the background, we could hear distant shouting and what sounded like helicopters. "They're not following me in here," she continued, her voice shaking. "They're just waiting at the fence line. Why aren't they following?" There was a long pause filled only with her labored breathing, then a sound that made Detective Vasquez and me look at each other in horror. A mechanical voice over loudspeakers echoing across the desert. "Weapons test commencing in T-15 minutes. All personnel clear the target zone immediately." Natalie let out a sob. Oh God. They knew. They knew about the test. They chased me right into it. The last 2 minutes were her running, the phone apparently in her pocket, recording nothing but muffled thuds and her desperate breathing. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the audio cut to static for about 10 seconds before ending completely. That static wasn't from damage. I've analyzed it 100 times. It was electromagnetic interference, the kind you get from a massive electrical discharge. Detective Vasquez returned with 2 federal agents who immediately confiscated all the files and made me sign a stack of non-disclosure agreements. They said Natalie had accidentally entered an active military testing ground, that her death was a tragic accident, and that Carson was just a local guide with no connection to anything sinister. But before they took everything, I'd already made copies. I'm not stupid, and something about this whole thing stank. I did my own digging and found out that Carson disappeared the same night Natalie died, and his truck was found burned out in Mexico a week later. The test that night? Officially, it never happened. There's no record of any weapons test at White Sands on that date. But I found something else. 3 other missing persons cases over the past 5 years, all solo travelers who'd hired local guides, all whose vehicles were found abandoned near restricted areas. The official causes of death when bodies were found were always exposure or dehydration. Natural causes, accidents. I think about Natalie every night, about how prepared she was, how careful, and how none of it mattered because she trusted the wrong person. I keep her last video backed up in places the feds will never find, because someday, when I figure out who's really behind this, the world needs to know what happened to her and the others. They weren't accidents. They were hunted. My Subaru's odometer hit 127,000 miles somewhere between Blythe and the trailhead, and I remember thinking that both the car and I had seen better days. At 37, with divorce papers still fresh enough that I kept reaching for a wedding ring that wasn't there anymore, I'd decided 5 days alone in the Sonoran Desert would either fix me or break me completely. Either option seemed better than another night staring at the ceiling of my empty apartment in Los Angeles. I'd been doing these solo desert hikes since college, back when my knees didn't protest after 10 miles, and a 40-pound pack felt like freedom instead of punishment. That morning in early October, I loaded enough supplies for 5 days and headed toward the Palo Verde Mountains, where forgotten mining roads cut through land that most people only glimpse from Interstate 10. My plan was straightforward. Park at the trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. 12 miles in by late afternoon, my GPS showed an old service road that probably hadn't seen a maintenance crew since Reagan was president. I found a perfect spot between two ridges, a natural depression that offered wind protection while staying high enough to avoid any flash flood channels. Setting up my worn two-person ultralight tent, I watched the October sun turn everything into shades of gold and rust, even making the decades-old beer cans scattered around look almost artistic. The temperature hovered around 75, with that particular desert heat that evaporates sweat before you realize you're sweating. No cell service out here, no emails, just miles of creosote bushes and the occasional jackrabbit bolting between rocks. I got my camp stove running for some freeze-dried pasta, optimistically labeled Alpine Minestrone, then sat on a flat rock to watch the sun drop toward the horizon. For the first time in months, that knot in my chest started to loosen. Just as the last slice of sun disappeared behind the western ridge, I stood up to grab my headlamp from the tent, and that's when I saw them. Bootprints in the sandy patch about 15 feet from my tent, clear and deep, like someone had been standing there for a while. The tread pattern was distinctive, some kind of military or work boot with deep chevrons, and they led straight toward my tent from the direction of the old service road. But here's what made me stop and stare. There were no prints leading away, just this one set coming toward my camp, and then nothing. I walked a full circle around my tent, checking every possible angle, thinking maybe the wind had obscured the exit tracks or they'd walked out on the rocky sections where prints wouldn't show. The rocks could hide footsteps, sure, but the approach was all soft sand and gravel, and those prints were fresh, maybe an hour or two old at most, the edges still sharp and crumbling. I tried to rationalize it while making dinner, telling myself that someone had probably hiked through earlier, maybe another desert rat like me looking for solitude. They saw my tent going up, decided to give me space, and backed out the way they came, stepping in their own tracks. It happens sometimes when you're trying not to disturb other campers, but the more I looked at those prints, the less sense that made. The spacing was wrong for someone walking backward, and the depth was too consistent, like they'd stood in each spot deliberately, watching. By the time I finished eating, full dark had settled over the desert, and I kept my headlamp on longer than necessary, sweeping it across the empty landscape every few minutes. The silence out there was absolute, not even wind through the creosote, just my own breathing and the tick of my camp stove cooling down. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of gravel shifting outside my tent, not the random scatter of a small animal, but deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps trying to be quiet. The sound would come in sets of 3 or 4, then stop for maybe 30 seconds, then start again, always from the same direction as those boot prints. I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle rigid, listening to what I gradually realized was breathing. Slow, controlled breathing just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent, maybe 3 feet from where my head was. I could hear the slight wheeze at the end of each exhale, like someone with mild asthma, or maybe just winded from hiking. My knife was in my pack's side pocket, but reaching for it meant making noise, and some primal part of my brain insisted that staying perfectly still was the only thing keeping that canvas barrier between us intact. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes according to the glowing digits on my watch. Sometimes it moved, circling the tent slowly, pausing longest near the zippered entrance. I kept waiting for the zipper to move, for fingers to test the fabric, for something to escalate this beyond just presence. But whoever it was seemed content just to stand there, breathing in that measured way, occasionally shifting their weight on the gravel. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sounds stopped. No footsteps walking away, no gradual fade into distance, just an abrupt end to the breathing and the gravel sounds. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I lay awake until dawn, my hand wrapped around the knife I'd finally retrieved, listening to nothing and wondering if nothing was actually nothing. First light couldn't come fast enough, and when it finally did, I unzipped my tent with the knife still in my hand, half expecting to find someone standing there. Instead, I found new boot prints, the same chevron pattern, but this time they formed a complete circle around my tent, maybe 6 feet out. The circle was perfect, like whoever made it had used my tent as the center point and walked around it multiple times, layering print over print. But the part that made my throat go dry was where the freshest set ended, right at the foot of my tent, toes pointing directly at where I'd been sleeping. The sand there was compressed differently, 2 deeper impressions like someone had stood in that exact spot for a long time, just watching the tent. I grabbed my phone to take pictures, needing some kind of proof that I wasn't losing it out here, and that's when I noticed something that turned my stomach cold. My phone showed 37 photos I didn't remember taking, all from around 3 in the morning. Every single photo was taken in complete darkness, the flash illuminating portions of desert landscape, and one recurring subject, my tent. The first few were from maybe 50 feet away, showing my little orange shelter glowing in the flash like a beacon. Then they got progressively closer, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. The last dozen were taken from different angles around that perfect circle I'd found in the sand, each one showing my tent from a slightly different perspective. In one, you could see the shadow of my body through the fabric, curled up in my sleeping bag. The timestamp showed they were all taken within a 15-minute window, right around the time I'd been lying there, listening to those footsteps, gripping my knife. But here's what really got me. In the last photo, taken from right beside the tent entrance, you could see a partial reflection in the tent's rainfly. A face, distorted by the curve of the fabric, but definitely human. Male, I thought, with hollow cheeks and eyes that caught the flash in a way that made them look silver. I should have packed up right then, hiked the 12 miles back to my car, and gotten the hell out of there. That would have been the smart move, the sane move. But something in me, maybe pride or maybe just the stubborn refusal to let some desert creep run me off, made me decide to stay one more night. I spent the day hiking the surrounding area, partly to clear my head, and partly to look for any sign of where this person might be camping. The old service road showed tire tracks from maybe a month ago, nothing recent, and I found no other tents, no fire rings, no trash, nothing to indicate anyone else was out here. Around noon, I climbed to the top of the eastern ridge and scanned the valley with my binoculars. Nothing but empty desert stretching for miles, heat shimmer making the distant mountains dance. I told myself whoever it was had probably moved on, some weirdo with a camera who got his kick scaring solo hikers. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself the second night would be peaceful. I set up a perimeter of sorts, stringing paracord with my bear bell attached between some creosote bushes about 20 feet from my tent. Not exactly high-tech security, but it would at least give me warning if someone approached. I also moved my sleeping position, putting my pack where my head would normally be and lying the opposite direction in my bag. If someone was watching through the fabric again, they'd get the layout wrong. As darkness fell, I kept my headlamp off, sitting outside the tent and letting my eyes adjust to the starlight. The Milky Way stretched overhead, so bright you could read by it, and for a while the beauty of it made me forget why I was sitting there like a guard dog. Around 10, I finally crawled into my tent, keeping my boots on and my knife within easy reach. I lay there listening to the desert sounds, a distant coyote, the rustle of a kangaroo rat, the normal night music that should have been comforting. The bear bell never rang. That's what I keep coming back to, even now. My little alarm system stayed completely silent, but around 2 in the morning, I woke to find my tent glowing faintly from outside. Not the sharp, sudden blast of a flashlight, but a soft, steady illumination, like someone was holding a lantern just far enough away to light up the orange fabric without casting distinct shadows. The light moved slowly, circling the tent counterclockwise, pausing every few feet. I could hear footsteps this time, deliberate and unhurried, and that same wheeze-touched breathing from the night before. But what made every hair on my body stand up was the sound that came next. My own voice, playing from what must have been a phone speaker, saying words I'd spoken earlier that day while hiking. 37 and starting over, my recorded voice said, tinny and distant. Either fix me or break me completely. The recording repeated those phrases over and over, mixed with the sound of my footsteps on gravel, my breathing from the climb up the ridge, even the zip of my tent from that morning. When the light finally stopped moving, it settled right where my head should have been if I hadn't switched positions. The person outside pressed something against the tent fabric, and I heard the distinctive click of a camera shutter, followed by the whir of an instant photo printing. They did this maybe a dozen times, each click followed by that mechanical whir, and I could hear them carefully placing each photo on the ground. The breathing got closer, so close I could smell something through the tent fabric. Sweat, yes, but also something chemical, like darkroom developer fluid. Then, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in days, raw and cracking, they spoke just one word: wrong. The light clicked off and I heard footsteps moving away, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking straight out into the desert. This time I could track them getting fainter and fainter until they blended into the ambient noise of the night. I didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't even shift position until dawn broke 3 hours later. Outside my tent that morning, arranged in a semicircle where my head should have been, were 12 instant photos. Each one showed my tent from the exact same angle, taken moments apart, creating a kind of stop-motion effect of the fabric moving slightly in the night breeze. But in the center photo, circled in what looked like red grease pencil, was the faint outline of my pack through the tent wall, right where I'd positioned it as a decoy. The word "wrong" was written across the bottom of that photo in the same red pencil, the letters pressed so hard they'd torn through parts of the image. I packed up faster than I'd ever broken camp before, practically running the 12 miles back to the trailhead, my neck cramping from looking behind me every few seconds. My car was untouched, thank God, though I found one more instant photo tucked under the windshield wiper, a picture of me from behind, taken the morning before as I'd hiked away from the parking area, completely unaware I was being followed. I drove straight to the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Blythe and filed a report showing them all the photos on my phone and the instant pictures I'd gathered up. The deputy who took my statement, an older guy named Hernandez, listened to everything with this expression that got more concerned as I went on. He told me there'd been similar reports over the past 2 years, always solo hikers, always in that same general area near the Palo Verde Mountains. Nobody had ever been hurt, but several people had cut their trips short after experiences like mine. They'd increased patrols on the service roads, but whoever was doing this knew the desert better than anyone, probably lived out there full time, moving camp constantly. Hernandez kept the instant photos as evidence and gave me his card, said to call if I remembered anything else. 3 months later, he called me. They'd found an abandoned camp about 5 miles from where I'd been, hidden in a narrow canyon. Dozens of instant photos scattered around, all of different tents, different campers, spanning what looked like years. A collection of recorded sounds on old cassette tapes, voices, footsteps, tent zippers, camp stoves. But whoever had been living there was gone, leaving only boot prints that ended at the rocks, heading deeper into the desert. They never found him. and as far as I know, they're still looking. I haven't been back to the desert since. The assignment had come through on a Friday afternoon, right when I'd been contemplating whether freelance photography was still paying enough to keep me in 29 Palms. Some boutique travel magazine wanted desert sunrise shots for their spring issue, offering triple my usual rate if I could deliver within the week. My landlord had been calling about February's rent, which meant saying no wasn't really an option. I loaded my Jeep Cherokee that night, checking the weather reports obsessively while packing every lens I owned. Clear skies predicted for the next 4 days, perfect conditions for what they wanted. The editor had been specific about wanting something different, something that captured the raw isolation of the high desert, away from all the typical tourist spots everyone photographs to death. I left my apartment at 3 in the morning on Saturday, driving out past the main entrance to Joshua Tree and heading toward the northern boundary where hardly anyone ventures. The service roads out there were mostly forgotten, used maybe once or twice a year by maintenance crews checking on old communication towers from the 60s. I'd scouted the area on Google Earth the night before, finding a ridge that would give me an unobstructed view of the sunrise hitting the valley below. The turnoff appeared right where the satellite images said it would be, marked by a rusted yellow gate hanging open and a sign that read, "No maintenance beyond this point" in faded red letters. The road beyond looked rough but manageable, just packed dirt and gravel disappearing into the darkness. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and kept going, figuring the worst that could happen was having to reverse back out if things got too sketchy. About 3 miles in, the road started deteriorating fast. What had been packed dirt turned into loose sand with deep ruts carved by flash floods from who knows how many seasons back. The Cherokee was handling it fine though, and according to my GPS, I only had another mile to reach the spot I'd marked. The headlights kept catching Joshua trees at weird angles, their twisted arms creating shadows that made them look like people frozen mid-dance. I remember thinking how perfect this was going to be for the shoot, how the magazine would eat up shots from a place this remote and untouched. The dashboard clock showed 4:47 when I finally reached the ridge, giving me just enough time to set up before the golden hour started. I could already see the faintest hint of blue on the eastern horizon, that beautiful gradient from black to indigo that only happens in the desert. I pulled off the main track onto what looked like a flat clearing, perfect for parking while I worked. The sand seemed firm enough when I first drove onto it, compacted by wind and occasional rain into something that felt almost like concrete. I grabbed my main camera bag and tripod from the back, leaving the engine running with the headlights on so I could see what I was doing. The spot I wanted was about 50 feet from the car, right at the edge where the ridge dropped off into the valley. Setting up the tripod in the dark while wearing a headlamp always makes me feel like some kind of desert astronomer, adjusting legs and checking levels while the rest of the world sleeps. After getting everything positioned, I realized I needed my wide-angle lens instead of the telephoto I'd mounted, so I jogged back to the Cherokee to grab it from my second bag. That's when I noticed the Cherokee had shifted. Not much, maybe 6 inches backward from where I'd parked it, but enough that the front wheels had settled deeper into what I now realized was much softer sand than it appeared. The headlights were angled slightly upward instead of straight ahead. I threw the car into reverse to back it onto firmer ground, just a quick adjustment, maybe 3 feet at most. The wheels spun freely, that high-pitched whine that every desert driver knows means trouble. I tried rocking it forward and back, gentle on the gas, keeping the wheel straight. The Cherokee sank another few inches. The sand under the front tires had turned into powder, the kind that flows like water once you break through the crusty surface. I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, my headlamp beam catching the dust particles still floating from my attempt to move. No cell signal, obviously. I knew that coming in. But I had water, food, and the weather was mild for early February. Someone would come looking if I didn't deliver the photos by Monday. I tried digging out the front wheels with my hands first, then with a collapsible shovel I kept in the emergency kit. The more I dug, the more sand flowed back in, like trying to make a hole in a bucket of flour. The sun was starting to rise behind me, painting the valley in shades of orange and pink that would have been absolutely perfect for the assignment. I actually took a few shots while I was thinking, muscle memory taking over even while my brain worked through the problem. By full daylight around 7:30, I'd accepted that I wasn't getting the Cherokee out on my own. The temperature was already climbing, probably hitting 70 degrees, and I could see heat shimmer starting to form on the distant mountains. I decided to record a video message on my phone around noon, when the heat was making me dizzy despite drinking water constantly. Just a quick thing to send to my roommate Wendy once I found signal, explaining where I was and that I needed someone with a truck and tow rope. I propped the phone against a rock and sat in the shade of the Cherokee, trying to look casual rather than desperate. "Hey Wendy, really stupid situation here," I started, managing a laugh that sounded forced even to me. "Remember that assignment I mentioned? Well, I'm stuck out on a service road north of Joshua Tree, about 4 miles from Highway 62, past a yellow gate with a no-maintenance sign. I gave her the GPS coordinates from my camera, described the Cherokee's position, told her to bring Keith and his F-150. The video ran for maybe 2 minutes before the phone screen went black. Dead battery. I'd been using it as a backup GPS all morning, and the heat had drained what little charge remained. The charger cable was in the Cherokee, but the car battery had died an hour earlier from my attempts to rocket free. The wind started picking up around 3 that afternoon. Nothing major at first, just enough to blow sand into my eyes whenever I stood up. I took shelter in the Cherokee, doors closed, watching the Joshua trees bend and sway through the dusty windshield. Then I saw something that made me sit up straight. Way off in the distance, maybe half a mile down the service road, a dust cloud was moving toward me. Not the random swirls from the wind, but a focused column like a vehicle would make. I grabbed my camera with the telephoto lens, using it like binoculars to get a better look. Through the viewfinder, I could just make out what looked like a dark-colored truck, moving slow but steady up the road. Relief flooded through me so hard I actually laughed out loud. Someone else had decided to brave the service road, probably another photographer chasing the same remote beauty that had lured me here. I stepped out of the Cherokee, waving both arms above my head, already rehearsing my embarrassed explanation and grateful thanks for the rescue. The truck stopped about 300 yards away. Just stopped, engine still running from what I could tell by the exhaust shimmer, but not moving any closer. I kept waving, even jumped up and down a few times, figuring maybe they couldn't see me clearly through the blowing sand. The vehicle sat there for what must have been 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Then slowly, it started backing up, reversing down the exact path it had come. I screamed at them to wait, actually screamed until my throat went raw, but the sound got swallowed by the wind. Through the camera lens, I watched the truck disappear back into the desert haze, that dust column gradually fading until there was nothing left but empty road and my own disbelief. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe they thought I was dangerous. Maybe they were lost themselves, maybe they didn't even see me. But something about how deliberately they'd stopped, waited, and then reversed made my chest tighten with a fear I couldn't name. The wind got serious as the sun started dropping toward the horizon. Not a dust storm exactly, but what locals call a blow, where the sand gets picked up in sheets and visibility drops to maybe 100 feet. I huddled in the Cherokee, feeling it rock with each gust, sand hissing against the windows like static on a dead TV channel. That's when I noticed the other set of tire tracks. Fresh ones, maybe a few hours old at most, running parallel to the service road about 20 feet away. They weren't from the truck I'd just seen. These were wider, deeper, like from something heavier. The tracks went about 50 yards past my position before curving sharply back toward the road and disappearing. Someone else had been here recently, close enough to see my stuck vehicle but hadn't stopped or left any sign. I took photos of the tracks with my camera, switching to manual focus because the autofocus couldn't handle the blowing sand. In the last shot, just as the memory card filled up, I caught something else. Headlights in the distance, multiple sets this time, arranged in a pattern that didn't make sense for normal traffic. Night fell hard and fast once the sun dropped behind the mountains. The wind had died down to occasional gusts, but the darkness out there was absolute, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I turned on the Cherokee's interior light briefly to organize my water bottles, trying to ration what I had left for however long this would take. That's when I heard the engines. Not one vehicle, but several, circling somewhere out in the darkness beyond where I could see. They'd drive close enough that I could hear the crunch of tires on sand, then pull away again, over and over like some kind of game. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, interior light off now, barely breathing. The sound patterns weren't random. They were coordinated, like they were taking turns approaching from different angles. At one point, high beams flooded the Cherokee's interior so bright I had to shield my eyes, staying on for maybe 30 seconds before cutting out completely. Then silence. Complete, total silence that stretched on for hours until I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Dawn came gray and hazy through a thick coat of dust on the windshield. The Cherokee was half buried, sand piled up to the bottom of the doors on the windward side. I forced the door open and stumbled out, my legs cramped from sitting rigid all night. The desert looked different, reformed by the wind into new patterns and small dunes. All the tire tracks from the night before were gone, erased like they'd never existed. My water was down to half a bottle, my lips cracked and bleeding despite the chapstick I'd been applying obsessively. I made the decision to leave the Cherokee and walk back to the main road, taking just my camera and the remaining water. But when I tried to orient myself, nothing looked familiar. The service road I'd driven in on was completely obscured, covered by fresh sand with no trace of the path. Even the distant mountains looked wrong, like I was seeing them from a different angle. That's when I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that whoever had been circling in the darkness hadn't been playing a game. They'd been waiting for the storm to do its work, waiting for the desert to erase everything, waiting for me to make exactly this choice. I started walking anyway, using the sun to head roughly east toward where Highway 62 should be. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and scan the horizon with my camera's telephoto, looking for any sign of the road or power lines or anything human-made. About an hour in, I spotted vehicles again, 2 pickup trucks parked on a rise maybe a quarter mile to my south, just sitting there with what looked like people standing beside them, watching me through binoculars. When I changed direction to walk toward them, they got back in their trucks and drove away, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. Like they were hurting me, keeping me walking in a specific direction. The heat was brutal by mid-morning, probably pushing 95 degrees, and my water was gone. I tried doubling back toward the Cherokee, but every time I turned around, one of the trucks would swing wide to block that direction, forcing me to keep going east into increasingly rough terrain. By noon, I couldn't walk anymore. I found a small overhang in a rock formation and collapsed in its shade, my camera still hanging around my neck out of pure habit. The trucks had disappeared again, but I knew they were out there, waiting. I managed to turn the camera on one last time, scrolling through the photos I'd taken, the sunrise shots that had brought me here, the tire tracks in the sand, and that final image of the approaching headlights. I deleted everything else to save battery and recorded one more video, whispering because my throat was too dry to speak normally, explaining everything that had happened, describing the trucks, the deliberate way they'd trapped me. The camera died halfway through a sentence. That's when I heard a helicopter in the distance and started laughing, thinking I was hallucinating. But it was real. A sheriff's department chopper that had spotted the Cherokee's roof still visible above the sand. They found me unconscious about 200 yards from the rock formation. Apparently, I'd tried to signal them and collapsed. The rescue team said they'd been searching since Monday when the magazine called asking about the photos. The sheriff's department never found any evidence of the trucks I described. No tire tracks, no sign of other vehicles in the area for weeks, according to them. They suggested dehydration and heat exhaustion had caused hallucinations, which apparently happens a lot in rescue situations. Maybe they were right, but when they returned my camera from the Cherokee, that last photo was still there on the memory card, the one with multiple headlights approaching in formation through the dust. The sheriff's deputy who looked at it said it was probably just lens flare from the setting sun, combined with blowing sand. Nothing unusual for desert photography. He seemed pretty convinced. even showed me similar effects in other desert photos online. I didn't tell him about the video I'd recorded on the camera, the one that should have been there but wasn't, like it had never existed. I didn't mention that the timestamp on that last photo showed 11:47 p.m., hours after sunset, when there was no sun to create lens flare. I just thanked them for saving my life, collected my insurance payout for the buried Cherokee, and moved to Portland 2 weeks later. I still do photography, but only urban stuff now, buildings, people, city life. Sometimes editors ask if I'd consider taking desert assignments again, offering good money for that isolated beauty everyone wants to capture. I always politely decline. Whatever was out there circling in the darkness that night, whether it was real or something my stressed mind created, I have no interest in meeting it again. My 14-year-old daughter Amber spotted it first, pressing her face against the dusty window of our SUV and pointing at something orange flickering between the creosote bushes. We were 2 hours into the dirt roads outside Furnace Creek, searching for a camping spot away from the crowds when she started tugging at my shoulder from the back seat. Her younger brother Max was asleep with his head against her arm, drooling slightly, exhausted from waking up at 4 in the morning for this trip. I'd been teaching 8th grade biology in Bakersfield for almost 2 decades, planning this Death Valley expedition since winter break, convincing my wife Lisa that we could handle 3 days of primitive camping with the kids. She'd finally agreed, taking time off from her pharmacy job, though she kept checking her phone for signal every few minutes, worried about being completely disconnected. What Amber had seen made me slow the vehicle to a stop, squinting through the afternoon glare at a half-collapsed tent about 50 yards from the road. Orange fabric whipped in the wind like a flag of surrender. One side completely caved in while the other 3 poles still stood at awkward angles. A ring of stones marked where someone had built a fire, the charred wood inside arranged in a perfect teepee formation that had long since burned out. But the strangest part was what sat beside it. A pile of clothing folded with military precision, each piece stacked on top of the other, as if someone had carefully organized their entire wardrobe before walking away. Lisa noticed them too, leaning forward between the seats, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she asked why anyone would leave their clothes arranged like that in the middle of nowhere. Against Lisa's protests, I decided we should report it to a ranger, just in case someone needed help or had gotten lost out here. Max woke up when I turned off the engine, rubbing his eyes and immediately asking for water, while Amber was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to investigate. I told them both to stay in the car with the air conditioning running while I walked over to check things out. The ground between us and the abandoned camp was nothing but loose gravel and scattered Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward a cloudless sky. As I got closer, I could see more details. The tent was a decent brand, probably expensive when it was new, with reinforced corners and heavy-duty zippers. The clothes were all men's, different sizes of shirts and pants, even socks rolled into perfect balls, and strangest of all, a pair of hiking boots placed neatly at the end of the pile with the laces tucked inside. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture everything from multiple angles, then jogged back to the SUV where my family waited. Lisa had that look on her face, the one she got when she had to tell relatives bad news at the pharmacy, all tight lips and worried eyes. We drove another mile down the road before finding our intended camping spot, a flat area protected by a cluster of large boulders that would block the worst of the afternoon sun. While Lisa and the kids started setting up our tent, I tried calling the ranger station, but of course there was no signal. We had a satellite emergency beacon for real emergencies, but this didn't quite seem to warrant that level of response. I made a mental note of the GPS coordinates and figured we'd report it when we drove back toward the visitor center for our Day 2 supply run. That first night passed peacefully enough, though I kept waking up every few hours, listening to the desert sounds outside our tent. Coyotes called to each other across the valley, their yips echoing off the canyon walls, and once I heard something large walking through our camp, probably a bighorn sheep based on the hoof sounds on the rocks. Lisa slept fitfully beside me, mumbling in her sleep about work, while the kids were dead to the world in their sleeping bags. Around 5 in the morning, just as the sky started turning purple at the edges, I gave up on sleep and crawled out to start the camp stove for coffee. The abandoned tent was still visible in the distance, a dark shape against the lighter sand, and I noticed buzzards had started circling above it, 3 of them making lazy loops in the warming air. After breakfast, we decided to hike to a small peak about 2 miles from camp, following an old mining trail I'd read about online. The kids complained for the first half hour, Max dragging his feet and asking every 5 minutes if we could turn back. But once we started finding old rusted equipment from the 1800s, they perked up considerably. Amber found a purple glass bottle half buried in the sand, probably from some patent medicine, and Max discovered what looked like part of an ore cart wheel. Lisa stayed close to me, holding my hand whenever the trail narrowed, still uneasy about the abandoned camp we'd found. We reached the summit around noon, the temperature already climbing toward triple digits, and ate lunch while looking out over the valley spread below us like a brown ocean frozen in time. That's when we saw the ranger's truck, a white speck moving along the road far below, stopping exactly where we'd seen the abandoned tent. The hike back down took longer than expected because Max had started developing blisters, and we had to stop every few hundred yards to adjust the moleskin on his heels. By the time we reached our camp, around 3 in the afternoon, the heat had become oppressive, turning the air into a shimmering curtain that made everything in the distance wobble like a mirage. The kids immediately retreated into the tent to play cards, while Lisa and I sat in our folding chairs under a tarp we'd strung between the SUV and a large boulder. We were sharing a warm beer, the last one from our cooler that had any pretense of being cold, when we heard a vehicle approaching. A park service truck pulled up beside our SUV, and a ranger stepped out, a tall woman with sun-damaged skin and wraparound sunglasses that reflected our camp like tiny mirrors. She introduced herself as Ranger Colton and asked if we'd seen anything unusual in the area. I told her about the abandoned camp we'd spotted yesterday, even showed her the photos on my phone, zooming in on the folded clothes and the collapsed tent. She studied each image carefully, her expression never changing, then handed my phone back and said something that made my chest tighten. That camp had been cleared 6 months ago, she said, after a 3-week search and rescue operation for a geology professor from UC Davis and 2 graduate students who'd gone missing. They'd found the tent exactly as I'd photographed it, clothes folded the same way, but no bodies, no tracks leading away, nothing to indicate where the 3 men had gone. The area had been thoroughly searched with dogs, helicopters, even thermal imaging drones at night. She said they'd removed everything, documented it all for the investigation, and she'd personally supervised loading the tent and belongings into evidence bags. Yet here I was showing her pictures from yesterday, of the exact same scene, down to the way the socks were rolled and the boots positioned. Ranger Colton asked to see the GPS coordinates on my phone, then radioed someone, speaking in codes I didn't understand before switching to plain English. She wanted backup to check the site again, mentioned something about another occurrence, and told whoever was on the other end to bring the special documentation kit. While she waited for the response, she walked around our camp, examining our setup with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, taking photos of our tent, our vehicle, even our camping chairs arranged around the dead fire pit. Lisa came out of the tent where she'd been checking on the kids, and I could see her pharmacy training kick in as she read the ranger's body language, the way she positioned herself between Colton and the tent entrance. The ranger noticed and forced a professional smile, telling us we should consider moving to the developed campground near Stovepipe Wells, that this area had been having some issues lately that they were investigating. We might have taken her advice if the kids hadn't been so tired and cranky from the heat, and if packing up didn't mean another 2 hours of driving on rough roads. Lisa and I discussed it quietly, while Ranger Colton walked back to her truck to make more radio calls, and we decided to stay just one more night, leave first thing in the morning. The ranger didn't seem happy about our decision, gave us her direct radio frequency and told us to call immediately if we noticed anything unusual, and I mean anything, she emphasized, even if it seemed minor. After she left, driving back toward where we'd seen the abandoned camp, the afternoon felt heavier somehow. like the desert itself was holding its breath. We made dinner early, nobody talking much, and we're all in our sleeping bags by 8 o'clock when the last light faded from the sky. I remember checking my watch at exactly 11:47 p.m. when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. The distinct metallic whisper of a zipper being pulled, slow and deliberate, somewhere very close to our tent. I lay perfectly still, every muscle rigid, listening to that zipper moving tooth by tooth in the darkness outside. Lisa was breathing deeply beside me, and I could hear both kids snoring softly in their bags, none of them aware of what was happening. The zipper stopped, and for maybe 30 seconds there was absolute silence, the kind that makes your ears ring from the absence of sound. Then I heard footsteps, not the random scuff of an animal, but measured, careful steps circling our tent, pausing every few feet like someone was examining our setup. My hand found the flashlight I'd kept beside my pillow, fingers wrapping around the metal cylinder while I tried to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped directly outside the wall where Lisa was sleeping, and I could hear breathing, slow and controlled, inches from the tent fabric. That's when I noticed our tent zipper, the main entrance, was moving, the pull tab sliding upward so slowly I could barely see it in the dim starlight filtering through the mesh window. The zipper had moved about 6 inches when Amber suddenly cried out in her sleep, a sharp "no" that cut through the silence like a gunshot. The movement stopped instantly, and I heard the footsteps retreat quickly, not running but walking fast, controlled, heading away from our camp. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent in one motion, bursting outside with the beam sweeping across the desert, catching nothing but empty sand and the shadows of Joshua trees. Our tent had been cut, a clean diagonal slash through the rainfly about 3 feet long, edges so straight it looked like someone had used a razor. I woke Lisa, whispered what had happened while she pulled the kids close, their sleepy confusion turning to fear when they saw my face. We packed everything in 20 minutes, throwing gear into the SUV without bothering to fold or organize, and started driving out with our headlights cutting through the darkness. About a mile down the road, my light swept across the spot where the abandoned camp had been, and the tent was gone, the fire ring scattered, but the clothes were still there, now arranged in a perfect circle on the ground with the boots placed dead center, laces tied together in an intricate knot I'd never seen before. We drove straight through the night, nobody sleeping, the kids huddled together in the back seat while Lisa kept checking the mirrors for headlights that never came. When we finally reached the visitor center at dawn, I marched inside to file a report with the first ranger I found, a young guy named Howell who looked like he'd just started his shift. I showed him the photos, told him about Ranger Colton's visit, the tent being cut, everything that had happened. He typed it all into his computer, nodding along, then stopped mid-keystroke when I mentioned Colton's name. He turned his monitor toward me, showing a staff directory, and asked me to point her out. But she wasn't there. No Ranger Colton on the current roster. No tall woman with sun-damaged skin matching her description. Howell made some calls, checked with dispatch about yesterday's patrol schedules, and came back looking puzzled. No ranger had been assigned to that area yesterday, and nobody had reported checking on an abandoned campsite or talking to my family. The investigation that followed turned up nothing concrete, just more questions that nobody could answer. The photos on my phone were real, the slash in our tent was real, but there was no record of Ranger Colton, no evidence of the abandoned camp when a team went back to check, and no explanation for how items from a cleared crime scene had reappeared 6 months later. The Park Service filed it as vandalism and suspicious activity, gave us a case number, and that was that. We never went back to Death Valley, never even talked about camping again as a family. Lisa found a therapist for the kids, told them it was probably just someone playing a cruel prank, maybe some locals who didn't like tourists. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those clothes arranged in that perfect circle, about whoever was breathing outside our tent, and about Ranger Colton, who knew exactly what was happening in that desert but doesn't exist. I still have the photos on my phone, proof that we saw what we saw, but I've stopped showing them to people because the looks they give me are worse than not being believed at all. The trail was supposed to be simple, barely 6 miles total, looping around a stretch of dry land dotted with brittle shrubs and sandstone ridges. I had driven out early that morning, eager to clear my head and take a few photos before the light faded. Hiking alone never bothered me. In fact, it was something I did to disconnect from everything that felt too loud. The plan was to park near the small rest area, follow the path to the ridge, and be back before sunset. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like a storm that never came. Even then, it felt different from any hike I had done before, as if the desert itself was paying attention. I remember the silence more than anything else. It was not peaceful, just heavy, the kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. Every step I took kicked up small whirlwinds of pale dust that settled around my boots before vanishing again. My backpack was light. A single bottle of water, my camera, a snack bar, and my phone. The GPS app marked the trail perfectly at first, the little blue dot following the dotted line as expected. Then, about halfway through, the signal flickered for a moment, and when it came back, I noticed I had drifted slightly east. I told myself it was fine. The sun was high, and I could always backtrack. By late afternoon, the heat had turned into something oppressive. The light changed in a way that is hard to explain, less golden, more like an old photograph starting to fade at the edges. I decided to cut across a flat area to rejoin the main trail faster, even though it was not part of the marked route. The ground was cracked and uneven, covered in thin white salt crusts that reflected the light almost painfully. I took a few photos out of habit, zooming in on a rusted piece of metal half buried in the dirt. When I looked closer through the lens, I thought I saw movement. Just a quick flicker, but when I lowered the camera, the space was empty again. I reached a point where the GPS stopped responding entirely. The signal bar showed nothing, and every direction looked the same. Endless pale ground and the shimmer of heat in the distance. I checked my watch, realizing I had only a couple of hours before dark. That was when my fitness tracker buzzed, showing my heart rate climbing even though I was standing still. I laughed nervously, thinking it must be the heat or dehydration, but the beeping kept speeding up. It sounded almost like a countdown, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint in the wind, a soft, rhythmic click, too steady to be random. The air had turned cooler, but the silence grew heavier, thick enough that every breath seemed to echo. I started walking toward a ridge that looked familiar, convinced it would lead me back to the main route. My shadow stretched long and thin, distorted by the uneven ground. That was when I noticed something strange. Faint indentations in the dust ahead, too wide to be animal tracks, but not deep enough to be human footprints. They ran parallel for a few yards, then stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had just vanished mid-step. I crouched to look closer, running my fingers along the edges, but the ground felt unusually smooth, like glass warmed by the sun. When I stood back up, I caught a brief reflection from something about 30 feet away. It was small, metallic, and half buried near a cluster of dry brush. I walked toward it, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots the only thing breaking the stillness. The object turned out to be a weathered radio, old enough that the brand name had faded off. The antenna was missing and the battery cover was sealed shut with dried mud. I turned it over, and as I did, it gave a faint click, so quiet that I thought I imagined it. Then, almost immediately, the air seemed to change temperature, like a wave of cooler air rolling through without any wind to carry it. I remember glancing at my camera, thinking I should record it, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense that I was standing somewhere I was not supposed to be. The lens captured nothing unusual, just dry terrain and the horizon bleeding into pale sky. But the sound in the background caught my attention. It was faint but rhythmic, a pulse-like tapping that came and went in short bursts. I looked around for power lines or loose metal that could be vibrating, but there was nothing. The desert stretched empty in every direction, and I began to notice how unnatural the quiet felt, as though something had swallowed up every sound except my own breathing. When I decided to head back, the GPS on my phone flickered again before dying completely. The battery had been at 70% minutes earlier. I told myself I could find the car by using the sun's position, but the light had shifted oddly, flattening everything around me. Every direction looked the same, just colorless ground and dry shapes that blurred when I stared too long. My heart was racing again, harder this time, and my tracker buzzed once more. I turned off my camera, zipped it in the backpack, and started walking fast. I kept thinking I was retracing my steps, but after a while I realized I was walking toward a place I did not recognize at all. After what felt like an hour of walking, the landscape began to play tricks on my vision. The horizon shimmered, and shapes formed in the heat, distant and uncertain. I could have sworn I saw a fence line ahead, but when I approached, it dissolved into nothing but twisted roots and sand. I called out once just to hear my voice, but the sound didn't carry. It died a few feet away, swallowed by the dry air. The silence was so deep it almost rang in my ears. I remember thinking that if I stood perfectly still, the world might stop noticing me altogether. When I checked my watch again, it showed the same minute it had 20 minutes earlier. The second hand ticked once, then stopped. I tapped the glass, convinced it was stuck, but it didn't move. For a moment I had the strange impression that time itself had thinned somehow, stretching and stuttering like a bad recording. The pulse from the fitness tracker continued, erratic now, flashing red every few seconds. Then came that sound again, the faint metallic click exactly like the one from the radio. It was behind me this time, steady, deliberate, like someone testing a switch on and off. I turned slowly, scanning the empty expanse. Nothing moved, yet I felt the air shift again, cool, then warm, like breathing in and out. My throat was dry enough to ache. I wanted to sit down, but the thought of stopping made me uneasy, as though the ground itself might open if I stayed too still. I kept moving, trying to head west, judging by the fading light. I found myself counting my steps just to keep rhythm, whispering the numbers out loud so I would not forget the sound of my own voice. The landscape had no pattern anymore. I might as well have been walking in circles. Eventually, I spotted what looked like my own footprints leading back toward a low ridge. Relief hit me hard enough that I laughed under my breath. The tracks looked fresh, too clean to have been made hours ago. But when I followed them, they stopped abruptly next to a small clearing, an oval patch of flattened ground surrounded by brush. My backpack was sitting there, zipped perfectly shut, as if I had placed it down carefully and stepped away. My shoes were beside it, side by side, neatly aligned. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought someone was playing a cruel joke. I took a step closer, certain I must have dropped the backpack earlier without realizing it. But the straps were spotless, no dust, no sweat marks, nothing that suggested I had carried it through miles of heat. The shoes were the same way, lined up like they were on display. A shiver ran through me, not from cold but from the strange neatness of it. I reached down to touch the zipper, and the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, I heard that metallic click again, louder this time, right next to my ear. I spun around expecting to see someone, but the space was completely empty. Even the light looked different, dimmer, like twilight had come all at once. I grabbed the camera from the backpack and turned it on, hoping the lens would catch whatever I was missing. The viewfinder showed the same patch of desert I stood in, nothing more. Then, for half a second, a faint distortion crossed the screen, a blur shaped almost like a person standing in the distance. The moment I blinked, it was gone. I hit record anyway, panning slowly around, my breath shallow. Somewhere behind me, that clicking sound repeated, this time spaced out, mechanical, deliberate. It echoed once, twice, then stopped altogether. I remember whispering, "Hello?" and realizing my voice did not echo back. The sun had almost vanished when I finally saw the faint shimmer of my car's windshield far off on the horizon. Relief flooded through me. I stuffed everything into the backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking fast. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was moving through invisible resistance. When I reached the spot where I thought the trail should reconnect, there was nothing, just unbroken desert. The sky had turned a strange shade of gray-blue, and I could not tell where the horizon ended. That was when the fitness tracker went silent. Its display froze, showing one last number flashing red before the screen went black. The final thing I remember is pressing the record button one more time, lifting the camera toward the empty land. The wind picked up for the first time that day, carrying a faint metallic hum that rose and fell like a signal trying to form words. The last frame I captured showed nothing but the cracked ground and dry brush swaying in rhythm. Then came that sound again, a single, clean click, and everything went dark. I work as a mechanic for a small auto shop just outside of Barstow, the kind of place where the wind never stops carrying sand across the parking lot. That afternoon was supposed to be simple. I had to deliver a replacement part to a client before dark, an alternator for an old pickup sitting on the other side of the desert. My boss had told me to stick to the main route, but there's always that temptation to shave an hour off the drive. When I saw the faded sign pointing toward Amboy Road, I figured it would be fine. The sun was still up, the air dry but bearable, and my truck had been running smooth all week. About halfway through the stretch, the heat began to build in that suffocating way that makes every sound sharper. The dashboard thermometer flickered past 110, and the horizon started to blur into that liquid shimmer you see above asphalt. I turned off the radio, just to listen to the hum of the engine. It had a faint metallic whine, one I hadn't noticed before. When I checked the gauge, the needle was creeping toward the red. I cursed under my breath, eased off the gas, and pulled over on the side of the road. When I lifted the hood, steam burst out like I'd opened an oven door. The radiator hissed and popped. I waited a few minutes, letting the heat roll off in waves before checking the coolant, bone dry. That didn't make sense. I'd checked it that morning. My phone had zero signal, but that didn't surprise me out there. The desert around Amboy Road stretches forever. No buildings, no signs of life except the occasional tumbleweed bouncing by like it had somewhere to be. A few miles ahead, I thought I saw something that looked like a billboard, just a dark rectangle standing out against the pale sand. It gave me a direction at least. I grabbed my water bottle and started walking, figuring I could reach it within half an hour. The air felt heavier with every step, like it was pressing down on my chest. My boots sank into the soft shoulder of the road, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of gravel underfoot. That's when I noticed something strange. The billboard didn't seem to get any closer, no matter how far I walked. After about 20 minutes of walking, I realized I was sweating through my shirt, even though the sun had started to dip. The billboard looked warped now, like heat was bending its edges. My tongue felt dry, but I didn't want to waste water yet. Every time I stopped, the silence pressed against me. No wind, no insects, just the faint crackle of heat coming off the sand. I thought I heard a low hum somewhere ahead, maybe a generator or power line, but it faded when I turned my head. The horizon shimmered in all directions, and I started to lose any sense of how far I'd gone. When the ground began to slope downward, I realized the terrain wasn't as flat as it looked from the truck. The sand shifted to hard-packed dirt, scattered with sharp stones and metal scraps that looked half-buried. I saw something glinting near my boot and bent down, a rusted canteen, dented and dry. The surface around it had deep cracks, like the earth had been pulled apart and left that way. I started noticing more debris, an old tire rim, a shattered bottle, what might have been the edge of a sign. It hit me that this might have been part of a mining site once. The billboard wasn't real. It took me too long to admit that. As I got closer, the rectangle dissolved into nothing, just light playing tricks through layers of hot air. But beneath it, there was a dark pit, wide and jagged, as if the ground had caved in decades ago. The edges were lined with wooden beams blackened by time. My boots sent loose gravel tumbling into the hollow, and I heard the faint echo bounce back up much longer than I expected. Whatever was down there went deep. Standing on the edge, I felt an odd vibration under my feet. Not enough to be movement, but like the earth was holding its breath. I called out just to break the silence, but my voice came back warped, as if someone else had repeated it from below. For the first time, I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't find the direction I came from. The sun had dropped behind a ridge, and the desert looked identical in every direction. My truck should have been behind me, but all I could see was the faint line of tire marks leading in a half circle. I tried retracing my own steps, following the indentations my boots had left, but they curved in ways that made no sense. They looped and overlapped, like I had been walking in circles without realizing it. The air shimmered again, and for a second, I thought I saw the shape of my truck in the distance, its silver outline rippling on the horizon. I shouted, but the echo came back wrong, thinner this time, stretched out like someone whispering the last syllable of my name. The sound of it made my throat tighten, and I started walking faster, even though my legs felt heavier with each step. The ground around me changed color as the light faded, shades of red, brown, and almost purple blending together. When I glanced back, I couldn't find my own footprints anymore. They seemed to fade as soon as I moved away from them. My water bottle clanked against my leg, still full, but I didn't feel like drinking. My mouth was dry, yet the idea of swallowing anything made my chest tighten. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, how unnatural it felt to be surrounded by so much space and still feel trapped inside it. By the time the last trace of sunlight disappeared, the pit looked different. It wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. It looked alive somehow. Shadows moved across it, shifting even though there was no wind. I stood there watching, convinced I saw something at the bottom. Small lights flickering like lanterns deep underground. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks, but a faint rhythm started rising from the pit, steady and low like the thump of machinery far below the surface. I turned away, but the sound didn't stop. I started walking again, this time not caring about direction. My only thought was to get away from that pit. The desert swallowed the light quickly, and soon I was moving under a sky crowded with stars that felt too close, too bright. The sand reflected their glow in a pale shimmer that made the landscape look unreal. At some point, I tripped over something half buried, a steel beam maybe, and when I got up, my truck was there again, same spot, same open hood. The air above it still wavered from heat, even though the night had turned cold. I walked around the truck twice, trying to make sense of it. The hood was still warm, and the keys were right there in the ignition. My footprints led away from it, a single winding trail that curved back in a perfect loop. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd just gotten turned around in the heat and walked in circles until dark. But when I looked back toward the desert, the horizon flickered again, and I swore I saw that same dark shape where the pit had been, pulsing faintly in the distance like a heartbeat. I got inside the truck, locked the doors, and sat there until the first gray light started to rise. My throat burned, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the water bottle on the passenger seat. The silence outside was complete, not even a breeze to move the sand. I tried starting the engine, and it came to life without hesitation, as if nothing had happened. I drove slowly back toward town, following my own tire tracks until the asphalt appeared again. When I finally reached the main road, my hands were trembling on the wheel, though I didn't feel cold or afraid, just hollow, like something had drained out of me. When I made it back to the shop, my boss asked if I'd gotten lost. He said the rescue crew had been called after the client reported I never showed up. They'd found my truck the night before, hood still warm, doors unlocked, but nobody around. According to them, they'd searched until dawn, following my footprints in a huge circle less than a mile wide. I wanted to tell him that couldn't be right, that I'd walked for hours into the desert, but the words wouldn't come out. I just nodded, pretending I didn't remember much after the engine gave out. It has been years since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. Sometimes I drive that route again, staying on the main highway, and I catch myself glancing toward the sand where the mirage should have been. There's nothing there, not even the faint outline of a pit. But once, just before dusk, I thought I saw a shimmer. A rectangle standing still against the horizon. It looked exactly like that billboard I never reached. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving until I saw the lights of town again. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Midnight runs were my specialty, especially that stretch of I-40 through Arizona, where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Been hauling refrigerated goods for 12 years, and after my daughter turned 18 and moved to college, those long nights on the road became my escape from an empty house. That particular September night started like any other, with me pulling a load of pharmaceuticals from Phoenix to Oklahoma City, the kind of high-value cargo that paid well but came with strict security protocols. My Peterbilt was my second home, equipped with everything I needed for a week on the road, including a comfortable sleeper bunk that I'd customized with extra locks and a small safe for my personal items. Around 2 in the morning, I pulled into a rest area near Flagstaff to update my logbook and stretch my legs, the kind of place where the overhead lights barely worked and the vending machines hadn't been restocked since the Clinton administration. Standing near the entrance ramp was this guy, maybe 45, wearing clean Carhartt work clothes and steel-toed boots that actually looked broken in from real labor. He approached my rig while I was checking the trailer seals, holding up a worn leather work bag and explaining how his ride to the copper mine had left him behind after a bathroom break, and if he missed his shift supervisor's morning head count, he'd lose his job for sure. Everything about him seemed legitimate, from the calluses on his hands to the way he knew specific mine terminology, even showing me a laminated ID badge for a mining operation I recognized about 60 miles east. He just needed a ride to the next truck stop where his cousin could pick him up, and since company policy technically prohibited passengers, he offered to stay hidden in the sleeper bunk until we got there, promising to keep quiet and not cause any trouble. Against every instinct I'd developed over the years, I told him to climb in through the passenger door and get comfortable in the back while I finished my mandatory break time. For the first 3 hours, everything seemed normal, as I pushed through the darkness toward New Mexico, occasionally hearing him shift position in the bunk behind me or clear his throat quietly. The electronic logging device showed me right on schedule. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily at -10 degrees, and dispatch hadn't sent any urgent messages about route changes or security alerts. I kept the radio low, listening to overnight talk shows discuss everything from alien abductions to government conspiracies, the usual background noise that kept solo drivers from going stir-crazy during those endless stretches of asphalt. The passenger stayed true to his word, keeping silent except for a polite request to use the portable urinal I kept behind the seat, and I actually started to feel good about helping someone who genuinely needed it. Around 5:30, with the first hints of dawn starting to lighten the eastern horizon, I pulled into a way station that was closed for the weekend, figuring I'd catch a quick power nap before the final push into Albuquerque. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping against metal, a noise that instantly triggered every security alarm in my head because I knew exactly where it was coming from: my locked toolbox under the bunk. Through the curtain separating the cab from the sleeper, I could see movement, deliberate and methodical, not the fumbling of someone looking for aspirin or trying to find the light switch. When I yanked the curtain aside, the passenger was crouched on the floor with my own socket wrench in his hand, working on the bolts that secured a hidden compartment where I kept emergency cash and my backup GPS tracker. But what really made my chest tighten was seeing him calmly photographing the broken seal on my trailer's internal access panel, the one that connected the cab to the refrigerated cargo area, a seal that absolutely could not be broken without triggering a massive security investigation. He looked up at me with this expression of mild annoyance, like I'd interrupted him during a routine maintenance check, then pulled out my own phone from his pocket, swiping through photos I hadn't taken, my regular fuel stops, the apartment complex where I parked on home time, even shots of my daughter's dorm building from her move-in day last month. "Morning, friend," he said in a voice completely different from the worried mine worker I'd picked up, now carrying a professional tone like someone explaining a business proposal over lunch. He set my phone on the dashboard, keeping it just out of my reach, and explained that his associates had been tracking my route for 6 weeks, learning my patterns, my stops, even monitoring which rest areas I preferred for my mandatory breaks. The pharmaceutical load I was hauling contained a specific batch of cancer medications worth about $3 million on the black market, information that definitely wasn't public knowledge, which meant someone inside my company or the client's operation had provided intelligence. He showed me timestamps on the photos, some taken just days ago, others going back over a month, including one of me having coffee with my ex-wife at a diner in Amarillo, proving they'd been watching me long before tonight. The mining story, the authentic-looking badge, the calloused hands, all of it was theater, carefully rehearsed to exploit the exact kind of sympathy that would make a lonely middle-aged driver break protocol on a dark night. What he wanted was simple enough to understand, but impossible to accept. I was supposed to drive to a specific coordinate, about 40 miles off the interstate, where his team would unload exactly 7 pallets from the middle section of my trailer, the ones containing the targeted medications. After the transfer, I'd continue to a predetermined ravine where I'd report my truck stolen, claiming I'd been ambushed at a rest stop while sleeping, and the company insurance would cover the loss while I walked away clean. He'd already manipulated my electronic logging device to show me taking a completely different route, sending false GPS pings to dispatch that placed me hundreds of miles from our actual location, creating a digital alibi that would make me look guilty if I tried to report what was really happening. The genius of their plan was its simplicity. If I cooperated, I'd be a victim, but if I refused or tried to alert anyone, the evidence would point to me as an inside accomplice who got cold feet, especially since I'd violated company policy by picking up a passenger in the first place. My CB radio, I realized when I glanced at it, had been opened up and rewired while I slept, the microphone cable neatly severed inside its casing, and my phone's battery, which had been fully charged when I went to sleep, now showed 2% despite being plugged into the charger he'd somehow disabled. He must have seen me eyeing the door handle because he casually mentioned that my keys were already with his partner, who was following us in a sedan about a quarter mile back, close enough to intervene if I tried anything stupid but far enough to avoid suspicion. The way he explained it, like discussing a pizza delivery route, made the whole thing even more terrifying because this was just another day at work for him, another driver to manipulate, another load to steal, another life to potentially destroy if things went sideways. When I asked what would happen if I refused to drive, he pulled up a video on my phone showing the inside of my daughter's dorm room, taken from her own laptop camera while she slept, her stuffed elephant from childhood visible on the nightstand beside her. Not a threat exactly, just a demonstration of capability, proof that their reach extended far beyond this truck, beyond this highway, into spaces I thought were protected by distance and anonymity. He even knew her class schedule, mentioning that she had organic chemistry at 10 on Mondays, information that turned my stomach into a knot of pure dread because it meant they'd been watching her too, studying her routines just like they'd studied mine. I started the engine because what else could I do? My mind racing through scenarios that all ended badly while he settled into the passenger seat like we were old friends on a road trip. The coordinates he gave me led through a series of back roads I'd never traveled, past abandoned gas stations and collapsed barns that looked like they'd been rotting since the Reagan years, the kind of places where trucks weren't supposed to go, but where someone could easily disappear. He made me turn off the dash cam, physically removing the memory card and crushing it under his boot heel, then had me disable the trailer's refrigeration alarm so it wouldn't alert dispatch when the temperature rose from opening the doors. Every few minutes he'd check something on a tablet he produced from his bag, tracking our progress against some predetermined timeline, occasionally sending messages to people whose roles I could only imagine. The worst part was how normal he acted between giving instructions, asking about my years on the road, commenting on the sunrise, even offering me a stick of gum from a pack he'd found in my console, as if we weren't in the middle of committing a federal crime that would end my career and probably my freedom. When we reached the transfer point, an abandoned grain elevator surrounded by rusted silos and dead wheat fields, 3 men were already waiting with an unmarked box truck that looked like it hauled furniture or appliances. They worked with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly which pallets to take, using a portable forklift they'd brought to move the medications from my trailer to theirs in less than 20 minutes. never speaking to me or even acknowledging I existed beyond being the driver of the vehicle they were robbing. The passenger supervised the operation while maintaining his grip on my phone and keys, occasionally showing me the tablet screen where my truck still appeared to be traveling normally along I-40, according to the spoofed signals being sent to my company's tracking system. One of the men spray-painted over the serial numbers on the stolen pallets. Another took photos of the remaining cargo to ensure they'd left the right items behind. And the third carefully resealed the trailer doors with a device that somehow replicated the original seal's code, making it look like they'd never been opened. The whole operation felt like watching a pit crew at a NASCAR race, each person knowing their exact role, their precise movements, no wasted motion or unnecessary communication, just criminal efficiency perfected through repetition. After they left with the medications, the passenger directed me to continue driving deeper into nowhere, following dirt roads that my GPS didn't even recognize, until we reached a ravine where old appliances and stripped cars had been dumped over the decades. He explained that I'd leave the truck here, keys in the ignition, doors unlocked, making it look like I'd been carjacked by opportunistic thieves who dumped the rig after realizing they couldn't fence pharmaceutical cargo. His partner would drive me to a truck stop about 50 miles away, where I'd call the police and report the theft, sticking to a script he made me memorize about stopping to help what looked like a broken-down motorist and being overwhelmed by multiple attackers. The beauty of their plan was that the physical evidence would match my story. The truck would be found abandoned, the high-value cargo missing, the electronic logs showing me miles away from where the actual theft occurred, and my violation of company policy by picking up a hitchhiker would be buried under the larger crime. He even had a bruise kit in his bag, offering to give me some convincing injuries to support my story, though I declined that particular service, already feeling sick enough about what I'd been forced to participate in. But something shifted in my mind when he mentioned my daughter again, reminding me that cooperation was my only option if I wanted to keep her safe from any future complications. That's when I noticed the tablet he'd been using was still unlocked, sitting on the dashboard while he gathered his things from the sleeper compartment, the screen showing what looked like a messaging app with timestamps and locations. Without really thinking about consequences, I grabbed it and took photos with an old digital camera I kept in the door pocket for accident documentation, capturing screen after screen of their communication network, pickup coordinates, even partial names and phone numbers. My fingers working faster than my brain could process the stupidity of what I was doing. He caught me just as I was sliding the camera back into its spot, his expression shifting from mild surprise to something darker, but then he actually smiled and said it didn't matter because the tablet would be destroyed within the hour anyway, and who would believe a driver who'd already lied to police about a hijacking? The confidence in his voice suggested this wasn't bravado, but experience, that he'd dealt with desperate drivers before, ones who thought they could outsmart the system only to realize they were already too deep in the mud to crawl back out. The sedan that picked me up from the ravine was driven by a woman who never spoke, just drove while the passenger sat behind me, making sure I didn't try to memorize the route back or do anything clever with the door handles. At the truck stop, they left me with my dead phone, $20 for food, and a final reminder that my daughter's safety depended on me following through with the story, that their organization had a long memory and an even longer reach for people who complicated their operations. I waited exactly 30 minutes like they instructed, then used the payphone to call 911, my voice genuinely shaking as I reported the theft, the lie coming out easier than I expected because most of it was true. I had been forced at gunpoint to drive my truck somewhere. Men had stolen my cargo, and I'd been left stranded at a truck stop. The police believed me. The company investigators believed me. Even the FBI agents who eventually got involved believed me, especially after the truck was found exactly where I said it would be, stripped of its valuable cargo but otherwise intact. What I never told anyone was about the camera's memory card I'd hidden in my boot, those photos I'd managed to capture, evidence I kept for 3 months before finally mailing it anonymously to the DEA from a post office 2 states away, along with dates, routes, and every detail I could remember about the operation. 6 months later, I read about a major pharmaceutical theft ring being busted across 3 states. Dozens of arrests, including several trucking company employees who'd been feeding them information about high-value loads. The article mentioned recovered cancer medications worth millions, sophisticated GPS spoofing equipment, and a network that had been operating for years using the same method, recruiting desperate drivers through carefully orchestrated hitchhiker scenarios. I never found out if my anonymous tip contributed to the investigation, but I recognized one detail in the news coverage. They'd tracked the gang through digital communications on encrypted tablets, the exact kind of evidence I'd photographed during those terrified seconds in my cab. My daughter never knew how close danger had come to her life, still doesn't know why I insisted she transfer to a different college mid-semester, or why I paid for her to change apartments and get a new phone number. I quit long-haul driving after that night, took a local delivery job that pays half as much, but lets me sleep in my own bed, behind doors I can lock, in a house where I installed security cameras that I check obsessively, even though it's been over a year without any sign of trouble. The passenger's words still echo sometimes when I'm driving past rest stops on the interstate. That casual confidence when he said they'd done this before and would keep doing it until someone stopped them. I think about all the other drivers out there pulling lonely night shifts, checking their mirrors for following cars, wondering if that person standing by the entrance ramp really needs help, or if they're bait for something worse. The company never found out I'd broken policy by picking up a hitchhiker. The investigation focused entirely on the theft itself, and I kept my commercial license clean enough to keep working, though I'll never look at a load manifest the same way again. People ask me sometimes why I switched to day routes, why I gave up the better money, and I tell them I got tired of sleeping in the truck, which is true enough even if it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I learned the hard way how one moment of misplaced kindness, one decision to help a stranger on a dark highway, can turn you into a criminal, whether you meant to be one or not, and some mistakes follow you home no matter how many miles you put between yourself and that rest stop in Arizona. February of 2017 found me hauling refrigerated produce from Florida up to Boston. Same route I'd been running since my divorce papers got finalized, and I needed steady miles to keep my mind occupied. Most drivers my age were settling into local routes, but at 43, I preferred the long stretches where nobody asked questions, and dispatchers only cared if you made your delivery window. That particular Wednesday night, I'd already logged 11 hours, and was pushing through that dead zone on I-95 between Jacksonville and Savannah, where cell towers get scarce and the only company comes from static on the CB radio. My Freightliner had just crossed the 200,000-mile mark that morning, and I remember thinking how she still purred like a kitten when I kept her steady at 65, riding that sweet spot where the diesel engine hummed its lowest note. Around 2 in the morning, just past mile marker 42 where the highway cuts through nothing but pine forest and swamp, I caught sight of another rig's lights in my mirrors, maybe half a mile back, but gaining faster than they should have been. Now any trucker will tell you that nighttime on these empty stretches creates a kind of brotherhood. We watch out for each other, flash warnings about speed traps or debris, check on drivers who seem to be weaving from fatigue. But this rig behind me wasn't following any of the unwritten rules we all knew by heart. He'd speed up until his headlights filled my mirrors, then drop back suddenly, then surge forward again, like he was sizing me up or trying to read my trailer numbers in the dark. My CB had been quiet for the last hour, except for the occasional ghost signal from truckers too far away to understand. But then Channel 19 crackled to life with a voice that sounded like gravel mixed with cigarette smoke. "Slow your roll, friend, we gotta talk," the voice said. And right away I knew this wasn't any DOT inspection or friendly warning about a blown tire. Real truckers don't talk like that. Don't use that fake casual tone that tries too hard to sound harmless. I kept my speed steady and reached for my CB mic, but before I could respond, the rig behind me hit its hazards and started flashing its high beams in a pattern. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long again. That's when my gut started churning, because that wasn't any trucker signal I'd learned in 20 years of hauling freight. I watched him in my mirrors as he moved into the left lane and pulled alongside my trailer, matching my speed perfectly while his passenger window came down and someone aimed a spotlight at my DOT numbers and the sealed door of my refrigerated unit. The voice came back on the radio, clearer now that he was right beside me. "Nice load you're carrying there, driver. 40,000 pounds of strawberries heading to Boston. Delivery tomorrow at 1600 hours to the Hunts Point warehouse." My knuckles went white on the steering wheel because that information wasn't something you could guess. Someone had either hacked into our dispatch system or had an inside source at my company. I glanced at my phone mounted on the dashboard, showing one bar of signal that kept flickering to none, and realized we were approaching the Ridgeland exit where there was a way station that had been closed for renovations for the past 3 months. Just a dark pullout with no cameras and no witnesses. The rig beside me started edging closer, not enough to hit me, but enough to make his intentions clear. We were going to have that talk whether I wanted to or not. I tried to accelerate past him, but another set of headlights appeared in front of me, a second rig that had been running dark until now, slowing down to trap me in the right lane. They had me boxed in like wolves cornering prey, and when I grabbed my CB to call for help on Channel 9, the emergency frequency, all I got was dead static like someone was running a jammer. The lead truck ahead started pumping his brakes, forcing me to slow from 65 to 40, then 30, as we approached that abandoned way station. My fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, enough to make Boston if I didn't stop, but not enough to outrun these guys if this turned into a chase. The voice on the radio came back, and this time I could hear other voices in his cab, at least 2 more people, all of them laughing at something that hadn't been said yet. "Here's the thing, friend," he continued, and I could tell he was enjoying this, drawing it out like a cat playing with its food. "Your company owes our mutual broker 60 grand for that Miami deal that went sideways last month. The one where your dispatcher claimed the load got refused but somehow still got delivered and paid out to the wrong account. Now we could handle this through lawyers and insurance companies, could make a real mess of things, get DOT involved, maybe have them crawl through every logbook violation and overweight ticket your company ever collected. Or we could settle this tonight, just between professionals, and everybody goes home happy." I'd never heard of any Miami deal, had been running the Boston route exclusively for 6 months, but the way he said it made me realize this wasn't about truth or lies. This was about 3 trucks against 1 on a dark highway where anything could happen and be explained away as driver error or equipment failure. The truck in front of me suddenly hit his brakes hard, and I had no choice but to follow him into the way station pullout, my wheels crunching over broken asphalt and glass from who knows how many years of neglect. As soon as I stopped, the rig behind me pulled in diagonal across the exit, blocking any chance of escape, while the one that had been beside me positioned itself along my driver's side, so close I couldn't open my door without hitting his fuel tank. Before I could even set my parking brake, I heard boots hitting pavement and saw a figure climbing up onto my trailer using the rear door handles, a thick-shouldered man wearing coveralls with no company logo and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had something in his hand that looked like a modified tire pressure gauge connected to a small metal cylinder, and he was heading straight for my glad hand connections, where the air lines from my cab connect to the trailer brakes. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice on the CB said, while I watched the man on my trailer kneel down near the connections. "All we want is 1 pallet from your load. Just 1 single pallet of those premium berries. Call it a finder's fee for helping you remember that debt. Your manifest shows 42 pallets, you roll into Boston with 41. Tell them 1 got damaged, some boxes crushed, had to dump it for safety. Insurance covers the loss, your company takes a small hit, nobody gets hurt, and we all pretend this never happened." Through my passenger mirror, I could see 2 more people had gotten out of the rear truck, both carrying what looked like crowbars or tire irons, standing casual but ready, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how it would play out. The man on my trailer did something with his device, and I heard a sharp hiss of air, then felt my trailer brakes engage slightly, just enough to know that whatever he'd done, I wouldn't be driving away without his permission. I reached for my phone to try calling 911, but the screen showed no service, not even emergency calls, and when I tried to take a photo of the trucks around me, The camera app kept crashing like the phone itself was fighting against me. That's when the real fear set in. Not the adrenaline rush of a dangerous situation, but that cold, deep dread when you realize how thoroughly you've been trapped. The CB crackled again, and this time it was a different voice, younger, with a slight southern drawl. "Your ELD just showed a critical fault, driver. Says you've been running off duty for the last 6 hours when you were actually driving. That's a federal violation right there. Could lose your CDL for that kind of falsification." I looked at my electronic logbook display, and sure enough, it was showing error codes I'd never seen before. My carefully logged hours replaced with gibberish that would make me look guilty of exactly what they were claiming. "Now here's where we're at," the first voice returned, sounding almost bored now that they knew they had me. "You can sit there and be stubborn, and we'll call this in to state police. Report an erratic driver who's been falsifying logs, probably on stimulants, aggressive, refused to stop when concerned fellow drivers tried to check on him. By the time cops get here, if they even come to this dead zone, they'll find your logs all messed up. Maybe find some contraband that wasn't there before, if you know what I mean. Or you can open that trailer, let us take what we're owed, and drive away clean, maybe a little lighter but still with your career intact." The man who'd been working on my trailer jumped down and walked to my passenger door, tapping on the window with that modified gauge device, grinning like we were old friends sharing a joke. Behind him, one of the others was already setting up what looked like a portable loading ramp, the kind you'd use to roll pallets off a trailer without a dock, and I realized they'd come prepared for this exact scenario, had probably done it dozens of times before to drivers just like me. Something inside me shifted then. Maybe it was pride, or maybe just the simple math that giving in now meant they'd own me forever, knowing I'd helped them steal once and could be squeezed again and again. I grabbed my CB mic and switched to channel 17, a frequency some old-timers still monitored, and started talking fast and clear. "Break 17. This is Unit 449 southbound at the closed Ridgeland scale. 3 trucks running a cargo theft setup, blocking me in, tampering with my equipment. Need immediate assistance. Any driver copy?" For a second there was nothing but static. Then suddenly multiple voices came through, truckers who'd been listening in the dark, and I heard someone say they were northbound 5 miles out and coming hard. The voice on channel 19 turned ugly quick. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, driver. You're gonna regret that." But I'd already started recording everything on my personal dashcam that they didn't know about, the one I'd hidden behind my sun visor after a friend got burned in an insurance scam. I kept talking on channel 17, describing the trucks, reading out partial plate numbers when their lights hit them right, and within minutes I could see headlights in the distance. Lots of them. A convoy of drivers who'd heard the call and decided enough was enough. The thieves saw them too, and suddenly their careful plan fell apart as they scrambled back to their rigs, the man with the device yanking something from my airlines that made a loud pop and sent air hissing everywhere. They peeled out of that rest stop so fast they left their loading ramp behind, and as the other truckers pulled in around me, creating a protective circle with their rigs, I sat there shaking, not from fear anymore, but from anger at how close I'd come to losing everything I'd worked for. One of the drivers who'd responded, an older woman driving for night transportation, helped me check my airlines and found the jamming device still partially attached, a piece of evidence that would later help state police track down similar attacks across 3 states. The police report I filed that night ran 12 pages long, and the detective who interviewed me said I was lucky. 2 other drivers hadn't been so fortunate that month, one run completely off the road near Fayetteville when he tried to resist, another found at a truck stop beaten so badly he couldn't identify his attackers. My damaged airlines cost $800 to properly repair, and my company had to send another driver to team with me to Boston. Since my ELD data was so corrupted, it took their IT department 3 days to restore it. But what still haunts me, what makes me check my mirrors constantly even now, 6 years later, is knowing how perfectly they'd planned it all. The dead zone location, the ELD tampering, the broker story that sounded just plausible enough, the way they knew exactly which buttons to push to make a driver choose between his cargo and his career. I still run that same stretch of I-95, still past that abandoned way station, now finally demolished and turned into just another patch of forest. But I never run it alone anymore. I joined a group of drivers who coordinate their routes through that corridor, making sure nobody's isolated in those dead zones where cell towers don't reach and help is just a wish. We've got our own channel now, Channel 38, and we check in every 20 miles. A rolling safety net of drivers who learned the hard way that the real danger on these highways isn't falling asleep at the wheel or blown tires or bad weather. It's the predators who know exactly how vulnerable we are out here, alone in our cabs with hundreds of thousands of dollars of cargo and nothing but a thin sheet of aluminum between us and whoever decides we're worth the risk. The FBI eventually arrested 7 people connected to that ring, though the voice on the radio that night, the one who seemed to be running the show, was never identified. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm running through that stretch, I still hear whispers on Channel 19, voices that sound almost familiar, asking innocent questions about what drivers are hauling and where they're headed. And I wonder how many more crews are out there, waiting in the dark for the next driver who's running alone, tired, and far from help. "12 years hauling freight across the western states teaches you which jobs to take and which ones to leave alone. But sometimes the money talks louder than your instincts. Most drivers my age were either settling into local routes or had moved up to owning their own rigs. But here I was at 37, still taking whatever paid best, still sleeping in truck stop parking lots and showering at Flying J locations from Nevada to California. My ex-wife used to say I was married to the road more than I ever was to her, and maybe she had a point, but those long stretches of empty highway paid for our daughter's college tuition. So I kept my complaints to myself and my eyes on the white lines disappearing under my headlights. When dispatch called me about a construction debris contract paying triple the usual rate, I should have asked more questions, but rent was coming up, and my transmission had been making expensive sounds lately. The job seemed straightforward enough. Pick up loads from a demolition site about 60 miles outside of Reno, haul them to a specialized disposal facility near the California border, mostly night runs to avoid the heat and traffic. The company, Silverstone Disposal Solutions, had all their paperwork in order, proper permits, insurance verification, everything checked out when I ran it through the carrier's system. They even offered a bonus for drivers who could handle multiple runs per week, cash paid daily, which wasn't standard but wasn't unheard of either in this business. My first pickup was scheduled for a Monday night at 11, and the directions took me way off the interstate, down a series of progressively narrower roads until I was navigating by GPS alone through terrain that looked like it hadn't seen development since the mining boom ended. The site itself was an old casino complex, one of those places that tried to capitalize on being halfway between Reno and nowhere, probably went belly up when the recession hit and never recovered. Chain link fencing surrounded the property, portable floodlights running off generators, and a crew of maybe 8 guys working with excavators and dump trucks, breaking down what was left of the main building. The foreman, a guy named Vince with arms like telephone poles and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, barely looked at my paperwork before pointing me to where they were loading. They had me back up to a pile of broken concrete, rebar, drywall chunks, the usual demolition mix, and started loading my trailer with an excavator that had seen better days. The operator knew his business, though, distributed the weight properly, didn't overload, and in 20 minutes I was tarped up and ready to roll. Vince handed me an envelope with $500 in cash, said it was for fuel and expenses, told me there'd be another $500 waiting at the disposal site. The whole thing felt more like a drug deal than a legitimate hauling contract, but I'd worked with contractors who operated in cash before, guys who kept their money away from ex-wives or the IRS. So I tucked the envelope in my jacket and headed out into the desert night. The disposal facility was another 2 hours west, and about halfway there, I had to pull over for a mandatory inspection at a weigh station that I knew would be closed, but still required a logged stop for compliance. Part of the routine was checking the load, making sure the tarps were secure. Nothing had shifted during transport. I climbed up on the passenger side, flashlight between my teeth, and started checking the bungee cords when I noticed one corner of the tarp had worked loose, probably from the wind resistance at highway speeds. As I reached over to resecure it, my flashlight beam caught something white among the chunks of concrete and drywall, something that made me pause and lean in closer. At first, I thought it was PVC pipe or maybe some kind of insulation, but the texture was wrong, too smooth, too organic looking. I pulled the tarp back further, used my hand to brush away some of the smaller debris, and that's when I saw the teeth. 3 molars still attached to a piece of jawbone, mixed in with the rubble like they belonged there. My first thought was that maybe it was from an animal, deserts full of dead livestock and wild horses, but I'd seen enough deer skulls and cow bones growing up in ranch country to know the difference. These were human teeth, human bone, and as I stood there on the side of my trailer in the middle of the Nevada desert, I realized that the crushing sounds I'd heard while they were loading might not have all been concrete breaking apart. The smart thing would have been to cover it back up, deliver the load, take my money and forget I ever saw anything, but I kept thinking about news stories I'd seen, missing persons cases, families waiting for answers. I took pictures with my phone, close-ups of the bones, wider shots showing them mixed in with the debris, then carefully covered everything back up and secured the tarp. My plan was to finish the delivery, act normal, then figure out who to contact once I was somewhere safe with better cell service. The disposal facility was exactly where they said it would be, a massive pit operation with industrial grinders and sorting equipment, the kind of place that could make anything disappear into landfill material within hours. The night supervisor, a nervous-looking guy who kept checking his phone, handed me another envelope without saying much, just pointed where to dump the load. I watched the excavator grab huge chunks of my cargo, including the section where I'd found the bones, and feed it all into a grinding machine that turned everything into gravel-sized pieces. The drive back to Reno gave me too much time to think, and by dawn, I'd made my decision to call the state police from a truck stop near Carson City. The detective I spoke to, a woman named Diane Reeves, took my report seriously enough to meet me within an hour, looked at my photos, took copies of all my paperwork. She told me to continue with my scheduled runs, act like nothing had changed while they investigated quietly. What she didn't tell me, what I found out later from another driver at a rest stop, was that I wasn't the first one to report finding human remains and construction debris from sites connected to Silverstone disposal. 2 other drivers had come forward in the past year, but both had mysteriously decided to recant their statements after receiving better-paying job offers from affiliated companies, jobs that took them far away from Nevada. Detective Reeves had me wear a wire for my next pickup, said they needed more evidence before they could move on Silverstone, wanted me to get Vince or someone else talking about what they were really hauling. The weight of that recording device taped to my chest made every breath feel like a confession, and when I pulled up to the demolition site that next night, Vince took one look at me and I knew he could tell something was different. He walked around my truck twice, slow and deliberate, ran his hand along the undercarriage like he was checking for tracking devices, then leaned in close enough that I could smell the cigarettes and coffee on his breath. He asked if I'd had any trouble with the last load, if anyone had given me problems at the disposal site, and when I said no, he smiled in a way that made my skin prickle with sweat despite the cool desert air. That night they loaded my trailer with unusual care, Vince personally supervising every scoop, and when they were done he climbed up to check the tarp himself, his boots leaving muddy prints on my running boards. He found my phone in the cab where I'd left it charging, turned it over in his hands like he was memorizing the model, then set it back down exactly where it had been. Before I left, he handed me the cash envelope but held onto it when I tried to take it, made me look him in the eye while he told me that Silverstone valued loyalty, that drivers who kept their routes running smooth could make more money than they'd ever dreamed of, but drivers who complicated things had a tendency to find other work real quick. The whole time he was talking, one of his crew members was taking pictures of my license plate, my dot numbers, making sure they had everything they needed to find me again if they had to. I made that delivery with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, dumped the load without looking at what might be mixed in with the concrete this time, and drove straight back to Detective Reeves at the state police station. The recording hadn't picked up anything useful, just ambient noise and Vince's carefully chosen words that could mean anything to anyone listening. Reeves said they'd need me to do one more run, maybe two, that they were close to getting a warrant, but needed something more concrete. And I laughed at her choice of words, even though nothing about this was funny. She promised they'd have undercover units watching me, that I'd be safe, but we both knew that was the kind of lie cops tell witnesses to keep them cooperating. I told her I'd think about it, needed to sleep on it, but the truth was, I'd already decided to take one more load from whatever long-distance company would have me, and never set foot in Nevada again. That night I parked at a Love's truck stop just outside Sparks, figured I'd be safer surrounded by other drivers than alone somewhere, and tried to get some sleep in my cab. Around 3 a.m, something woke me up, a subtle shift in the weight of my truck, like someone had climbed onto the back. I lay still, listening, heard footsteps on the metal deck of my trailer, moving slowly from the rear toward the cab. Through my side mirror, I could see a shadow, human-shaped but moving wrong, checking each tie-down strap, each tarp corner, methodical and patient like they had all night to do whatever they'd come to do. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my sleeper, and I heard fingers running along the rivets of my door, testing the lock, and a voice I recognized but couldn't quite place whispered my name, my actual name, not my handle or my company number, and told me that Silverstone had a message for me about keeping my scheduled runs. I didn't wait to hear the rest of the message, just fired up the engine and pulled out of that parking spot so fast I nearly clipped the fuel island. Saw in my mirrors the shadow figure stumbling backward off my running board. Other drivers were already stirring, lights coming on in nearby cabs, and I knew whoever had come for me wouldn't try anything with that many witnesses around. I drove straight through the rest of the night, called Detective Reeves from the road and told her everything, said I was done being bait, that she had 12 hours before I was crossing into Oregon and never coming back. She tried to convince me to stay, said they were hours away from making arrests, but then I heard something in the background of her call, Vince's voice talking to someone in her office, asking about paperwork for a witness who'd been in an unfortunate trucking accident, and I knew right then that Silverstone's reach went deeper than anyone had imagined. The FBI raids happened 6 days later, made national news for about a week before getting buried under political scandals and celebrity divorces. But by then, I was already running produce from Washington to Montana, sleeping in different truck stops every night, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to track my patterns. They arrested 17 people, including Vince, found evidence linking Silverstone to disposal of bodies from organized crime hits across 3 states, victims who'd been mixed into construction debris and scattered across legitimate landfills where they'd never be found or identified. Detective Reeves sent me one message saying they couldn't have done it without my photos and initial report, but I knew better than to respond. Knew that even with Vince locked up, there were others out there who remembered my face, my truck, my name. Some nights I still wake up thinking I hear footsteps on my trailer, still check my mirrors for vehicles that follow too long, still wonder about every load of construction debris I see on the highway, and what secrets might be buried beneath those blue tarps, ground down into dust and scattered to the desert wind. My CDL still sits in my wallet, expired now for 2 years. Right behind the credit cards I maxed out paying for lawyers after everything went sideways with that government contract job. I keep meaning to throw the license away, but something always stops me. Maybe because getting rid of it would mean accepting that my trucking days are really over, that what happened on Highway 54 outside Liberal, Kansas, changed everything permanently. Secured Transit Solutions hired me for what seemed like a straightforward flatbed haul in early November. Just another specialized equipment run from their facility near Topeka to a research center in Colorado Springs. I'd been driving flatbed for over a decade by then, mostly independent contracts after leaving my job with a major carrier when I turned 33, and government subcontractor work paid well enough to keep my Peterbilt running and the mortgage current on my place outside Wichita. Carla from STS called me directly, said she got my number from another driver who'd done classified hauls before, and asked if I could be at their loading facility within 48 hours for a priority shipment. The money she quoted made me sit up straight at my kitchen table, triple my usual rate with a cash advance that would hit my account before I even hooked up the trailer. She emailed over the contracts, pages and pages of confidentiality agreements and liability waivers, all standard-looking legal language except for one section that specified I couldn't discuss the cargo with anyone, including law enforcement, unless presented with a federal warrant. The loading appointment was set for 6 in the morning on a Monday, and when I arrived at their facility, a converted warehouse complex surrounded by fresh razor wire and cameras every 20 feet, 2 guards in unmarked uniforms checked my ID 3 times before waving me through the gate. Inside the loading bay, they already had the cargo on a specialized flatbed trailer, everything covered with military-grade tarps that had been heat-sealed at the edges and secured with numbered cable locks that I wasn't allowed to touch. The load itself was strange. 3 identical rectangular shapes about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned perfectly parallel to each other with custom steel brackets holding them in place. I walked around the trailer doing my standard pre-trip inspection, while a guy in a black polo shirt followed me with a clipboard, writing down every move I made, even noting when I checked the tire pressure. When I tried to peek under one corner of the tarp to verify the load was properly secured, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and reminded me about the confidentiality agreement I'd signed. They handed me a sealed envelope with routing instructions that I wasn't supposed to open until I left the facility, along with a cheap prepaid phone that I was told to keep on at all times. Carla appeared one more time before I left, walking up to my cab window with another set of papers for me to sign, these ones acknowledging that I understood the federal penalties for discussing classified materials. She leaned in close enough that I could smell her coffee breath and told me that this load was time-sensitive, that people were counting on me to deliver it exactly as instructed, no stops except at the 3 designated fuel stations marked on my route. The way she said it made the hair on my arm stand up, like there was some kind of threat hidden in her words. But the deposit had already cleared in my account, and backing out would mean returning money I'd already mentally allocated to overdue bills. I opened the envelope once I hit Highway 50, pulling over at a way station to read through the instructions, while my hands trembled slightly from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The route they'd mapped out made no sense, taking me south through Liberal instead of the direct path west on 70, adding at least 4 hours to what should have been a simple 8-hour drive. Each fuel stop had specific instructions: park in the northwest corner of the lot, leave the engine running, go inside for exactly 15 minutes, buy something, use the restroom, return to the truck without speaking to other drivers. The prepaid phone rang as I was reading, a robotic voice asking for my exact GPS coordinates, then hanging up before I could ask any questions. Everything went smooth for the first 3 hours, just me and the steady hum of the diesel engine, watching the Kansas farmland roll by in the pale morning light. Made my first scheduled stop at a Shell station near Pratt, followed the instructions to the letter, bought a sandwich I didn't want, and used a bathroom I didn't need while watching the clock on my phone. Nobody approached the truck while I was inside, but when I came back out, there was a white sedan parked 3 spaces away with tinted windows and government plates, engine running, nobody visible inside. The same car followed me back onto the highway, staying exactly 5 car lengths behind for the next 30 miles, before taking an exit that led to nothing but wheat fields. The second stop was supposed to be at a Conoco near Meade, but when I got there around noon, the place was crawling with state troopers. 4 cruisers parked at different angles around the pumps like they were waiting for something. I circled the lot once, my gut telling me to keep driving, but the prepaid phone started ringing non-stop until I finally pulled in and parked where I'd been instructed. None of the troopers even looked my way, which somehow made it worse, like they were deliberately avoiding eye contact. Inside the store, the clerk, a kid maybe 19 with bad acne scars, kept glancing at the door while he rang up my energy drink, and when he handed me my change, he whispered something that sounded like, "They're watching," before turning away to stock cigarettes. By the time I reached Highway 54 heading toward Liberal, the weather had turned nasty, dark clouds rolling in from the west, with that greenish tinge that makes any Midwest driver nervous about tornadoes. The prepaid phone had been silent since the Conoco stop, which worried me more than the constant check-ins. About 15 miles outside Liberal, just past a sign for some abandoned grain elevator, I saw them in my mirrors. 2 black Suburbans coming up fast, no plates visible, windows dark as oil. They boxed me in smooth as anything, one in front and one behind, and the lead vehicle hid its hidden blue lights, the kind mounted behind the grille that you'd never notice until they were flashing right in your face. I pulled over on the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. 4 men got out, all wearing identical black tactical pants and navy windbreakers with no agency markings, just little radio earpieces and holstered sidearms. The one who approached my window had a shaved head and a neck tattoo that looked military, some kind of unit insignia I didn't recognize. He didn't show a badge, didn't introduce himself, just told me to step out of the vehicle and keep my hands visible. When I asked what this was about, he grabbed my arm and yanked me down from the cab, nearly dislocating my shoulder in the process. They made me stand facing my truck while they cut the cable seals on the tarps, the sound of the bolt cutters echoing across the empty fields. One of them climbed up on the trailer with some kind of handheld scanner, running it over each of the 3 shapes, while another guy typed on a military-grade laptop balanced on the hood of their Suburban. The scanner started clicking like a Geiger counter, faster and faster as he moved it toward the middle container, and suddenly all 4 of them backed away from the trailer like it was about to explode. The guy with the neck tattoo got on his radio, speaking in some kind of code I couldn't follow, lots of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me, but his voice had gone from aggressive to genuinely scared. Within 10 minutes, the whole area turned into a circus, helicopters appearing from nowhere, more black vehicles streaming down the highway, guys in hazmat suits setting up some kind of perimeter around my truck. They put me in the back of one of the Suburbans, no handcuffs, but the door handles didn't work from the inside, and I sat there for 3 hours watching them work through the tinted windows. Nobody would answer my questions. Nobody would tell me what was in those containers. Just kept asking me the same things over and over. Who hired me? What route was I supposed to take? Did I stop anywhere that wasn't on the manifest? The guy with the neck tattoo finally came back, tossed my CDL and phone on the seat next to me, and told me I was free to go, but the truck and trailer were being impounded for national security reasons. They drove me to a motel in Garden City, paid for a week in advance, and told me not to leave town until someone contacted me. The next morning, Secured Transit Solutions' phone number was disconnected, their website gone, like they'd never existed at all. I tried calling Carla's direct line, but it just rang and rang with no voicemail. 3 weeks later, I saw it on the news while eating breakfast at a diner. An industrial explosion at a chemical plant in Nebraska. 4 dead, investigators finding traces of materials that matched the serial numbers from my impounded trailer. The FBI showed up at my door that same afternoon with a warrant, seized my laptop and all my paperwork, started asking about my connections to domestic terrorist groups, whether I knew what I was really hauling, why I'd deviated from the planned route when I hadn't deviated at all. My lawyer, a former JAG officer I found through a veterans group, managed to get the charges dropped after 8 months of pure hell, but by then the damage was done. Word had gotten around the trucking community that I was under federal investigation. Insurance companies wouldn't touch me, and nobody wanted to hire a driver who might bring that kind of heat to their operation. The lawyer dug up some interesting stuff, though. Secured Transit Solutions had been incorporated just 2 days before they contacted me, dissolved the day after my cargo got intercepted, and the address they'd given me led to an empty lot that had been vacant for years according to county records. The facility where I'd picked up the load had security footage, but somehow all the cameras had malfunctioned that morning, every single one, and the guard company had no record of ever providing personnel to that location. I still get calls sometimes, always from blocked numbers, asking if I remember anything else about that day, if I've talked to anyone about what happened, reminding me that my NDAs are still legally binding even though the company no longer exists. My wife thinks I should just forget about it, move on with our lives, maybe go back to school and learn a trade that doesn't involve driving. But late at night when I can't sleep, I keep thinking about those 3 containers and whatever was making that scanner go crazy, wondering if I was hauling something that ended up killing those people in Nebraska, or if maybe those men in the Suburbans saved a lot more lives by stopping me when they did. Either way, I know I'll never get answers, just like I know there's probably someone watching my house right now, making sure I keep my mouth shut about the whole thing, which is exactly what I've done until now, posting this from a library computer 2 states away, because I figure people deserve to know that sometimes your own government will use you, frame you, and throw you away without a second thought. Anyone who's driven a rig for a living knows the industry runs on 2 things: fuel and trust. When both start running low, you make decisions you wouldn't normally make. That's where I was in March of 2023, 41 years old with a small fleet of 3 trucks that were bleeding me dry on repairs. My best driver had just quit to work for one of the mega carriers, and I was staring down a month where I'd have to choose between making the insurance payment or keeping the trucks running. That's when I got the email from a broker I'd never heard of before, Westline Logistics, offering rates that were 30% higher than what I was used to seeing. The loads were overnight runs, always starting after 8 in the evening, always ending before dawn. The email said they specialized in time-sensitive freight for clients who valued discretion. I should have known better, but desperation has a way of making red flags look like opportunities. The first job seemed straightforward enough. Pick up a sealed container at a warehouse outside Louisville, drive it to a distribution center near Indianapolis, drop it off, collect payment. The paperwork looked legitimate, proper BOL, all the right stamps and signatures, even had dot numbers that checked out when I looked them up online. The weird part was the pickup itself. The warehouse was in an industrial zone that looked half abandoned, just one building with lights on in a sea of dark structures. A guy in a Westline Logistics jacket met me at the loading dock, wouldn't make eye contact, just handed me the keys to the container and told me the code for the lock. He made me sign a separate non-disclosure agreement right there on a clipboard, said it was standard procedure for sensitive cargo. I asked what was in the container, and he gave me this rehearsed line about proprietary manufacturing equipment. The whole interaction took maybe 5 minutes. I hooked up the container, checked the seals were intact like the paperwork specified, and headed out. The drive was quiet, just me and the highway and the nagging feeling that I should have asked more questions. The payment hit my account before I even made it back home, which never happens in this business. Usually you're waiting weeks for brokers to process payments, chasing down invoices, dealing with short pays and deductions. But Westline paid in full, plus a bonus for what they called professional discretion. That money kept my operation alive for another month. So when they emailed again a week later with another overnight run, same rate plus an extra $200 for fuel, I didn't hesitate. Then it became a pattern. Every week, sometimes twice a week, always overnight runs, always sealed containers, always different pickup and drop-off locations across the Midwest. The paperwork was always perfect, the payments always immediate. I started recognizing some of the warehouse locations, noticed they were always in these isolated industrial areas where nobody would pay attention to truck traffic at odd hours. The loading dock workers were different each time, but they all had that same nervous energy, that same refusal to make conversation. One time I tried to make small talk with a guy who looked about 20, asked him how long he'd been working for Westline, and he just stared at me like I'd asked him to confess to a crime. He mumbled something about being a contractor and practically ran back inside. About 2 months in, I started noticing other trucks at these locations. Not the same trucks, but they all had something in common. They were owner-operators like me. Smaller outfits, guys running 1 or 2 rigs. I'd see them at the pickup points, waiting in the staging areas, and we'd do that trucker nod. That acknowledgement that we were all part of the same world. But nobody talked. There was this unspoken understanding that you didn't ask questions about Westline jobs. The money was too good, and we all needed it too badly. One night at a warehouse outside Dayton, I saw a Peterbilt that looked familiar. A custom paint job in deep blue with silver flames that I swear I'd seen at a truck stop months earlier. The driver was gone though, just the truck sitting there in the lot with its lights off. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would leave a rig that nice unattended, but I was already running late for my own pickup. I didn't think about it again until much later, when I should have been paying attention to all the small details that were adding up to something very wrong. The job that changed everything came on a Wednesday in early May. Westline sent me coordinates instead of an address, which was a first, along with instructions to arrive at exactly 11:30 at night, not earlier, not later. The location was way out in rural Pennsylvania, nearly 3 hours from where I'd made my last delivery. The route took me off the interstate onto progressively smaller roads until I was on a 2-lane county highway, with nothing but farmland and woods on either side. My GPS kept trying to reroute me back to main roads, like it didn't believe this destination could be real. When I finally found the turnoff, it was just a gravel road with no sign, no mailbox, nothing to indicate what was back there. I checked the coordinates 3 times before I committed to turning in. The road went on for maybe half a mile through dense trees, and then suddenly opened up into this massive clearing with a chain-link fence topped with razor wire running the entire perimeter. There were sodium lights mounted on tall poles, bathing everything in that harsh orange glow that makes everything look like a crime scene. The gate was closed, and there were 2 men standing in front of it wearing security uniforms and carrying what I'm pretty sure were rifles, not just handguns. I stopped about 50 feet from the gate, engine idling, trying to figure out what kind of legitimate business operation needed this level of security in the middle of nowhere. One of the guards walked up to my window, shined a flashlight directly in my face, and asked for my name and confirmation number without any greeting or explanation. I gave him the information, and he walked back to a small guardhouse I hadn't noticed before, made a phone call, then came back and told me to proceed to loading dock 7. The gate rolled open with this grinding mechanical sound that seemed way too loud in the quiet night. As I drove through, I got my first real look at what was inside the fence, and that's when my chest started feeling tight. There were trucks everywhere. Not just a few, but dozens of them, lined up in neat rows like some kind of vehicle graveyard. Big rigs, day cabs, sleepers, all different makes and models, all just sitting there dark and empty. I recognized the blue Peterbilt immediately, parked in the 3rd row with 6 other trucks that looked just as well maintained and expensive. None of them looked abandoned or junked. They looked like they'd been driven there yesterday and parked carefully. The loading docks were along one side of the property, attached to a long metal building with no windows and no company name anywhere visible. I backed into dock 7 like I'd been instructed, but my mind was racing through every possible explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe it was a fleet storage facility. Maybe these were trucks being held for auction or repair. But that didn't explain the armed guards or the razor wire, or the complete absence of any identifying information. A man in a different uniform, not security but something like a supervisor, came out and knocked on my door. He had a tablet in his hand and that same avoidance of eye contact I'd seen from every other Westline worker. He told me to leave the engine running, exit the vehicle, and come inside to complete the paperwork. Something in his tone wasn't a request, it was an instruction, the kind you don't argue with. I climbed down from the cab, and he walked me through a metal door into a hallway that smelled like oil and something chemical I couldn't identify. The walls were bare concrete block, the floors were stained, and there were more cameras than I'd ever seen in any warehouse, mounted in every corner. Every doorway, all of them with little red lights indicating they were recording. He led me into a small office where another man was sitting behind a desk, older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt with a Westline Logistics logo embroidered on it. The man behind the desk smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. He gestured to a chair and said we needed to go over some additional documentation for this particular load. He slid a stack of papers across the desk, and I started reading through them. But the language was dense and confusing, full of legal terminology about asset transfers and equipment reassignment and liability waivers. I asked what this was about, why this job required different paperwork than the others, and he leaned back in his chair and said something that made every instinct in my body scream. He said that given the nature of the operation and the sensitive cargo I'd been transporting, they needed to ensure complete operational security going forward. I asked what he meant by going forward, and he just kept smiling that flat smile. Then he said that my truck would need to remain on the property for a standard safety inspection and equipment verification process that would take approximately 72 hours. I stood up and said that wasn't part of the agreement, that I had other deliveries scheduled, that I needed my truck. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, just calmly said that the inspection was non-negotiable and outlined in the contract I'd signed 2 months ago. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, and realized I had no signal. Not one bar. He noticed me checking and mentioned that the property had cellular interference due to the security systems. That's when I knew I wasn't leaving. I tried to keep my voice steady and asked if I could at least get my personal belongings from the cab. He nodded and said one of the security personnel would escort me. We walked back out to the loading dock, and the guard who came with me wasn't the friendly escort type. He stood close enough that I could smell his cologne, watching my every move as I grabbed my duffel bag, my logbook, and my wallet from inside the sleeper. That's when I noticed something that sent a jolt of pure panic through me. The VIN plate on my dashboard, the one that's riveted in place and never supposed to be removed, had a small scratch mark around the rivets, like someone had been measuring or photographing it. I looked at the guard and he was already staring at me, waiting for me to finish up. I grabbed what I could and let him walk me back inside, this time to a different part of the building. He opened a door to what looked like a break room, except there were 4 other guys in there, all of them with that same exhausted, trapped expression. One of them was wearing a Schneider Company shirt, another had a Cat Diesel power cap, all of them owner-operators by the look of it. The guard told me to wait there, that someone would bring me dinner and that I'd be called when my inspection was complete. Then he locked the door from the outside. The second the lock clicked, one of the men, heavyset guy with a gray beard and wearing a worn denim jacket, looked at me and said, "How many runs did you do for them before they brought you here?" I told him maybe 15, 20 loads over 2 months. He shook his head and said he'd done 37 before they'd finally pulled him in. Another guy, younger with a southern accent and grease stains on his jeans, said he'd been in this room for 5 days. 5 days. I asked what they were doing with the trucks, and the man with the beard said exactly what I'd been afraid to think. They were stealing them, not through force but through paperwork. Every load we'd hauled had been legitimate enough to establish a pattern of trust. Meanwhile, they were collecting our information, our routes, our registration details, everything they needed to create false ownership documents. Once they had your truck on this property, they'd re-VIN it, forge new titles, and sell it off to chop shops or overseas buyers. As for the drivers, we'd signed NDAs and contracts so dense with legal language that we'd basically agreed to keep our mouths shut or face massive lawsuits. But more than that, they had documentation showing we'd willingly driven loads for them dozens of times, which meant if anyone went to the police, we'd look just as complicit. The younger guy said 2 drivers had already signed over their trucks rather than risk prosecution. They'd been given $5,000 cash and dropped off at a bus station with a story about selling their equipment to pay debts. Nobody would question it. Nobody would investigate, and the trucks would disappear into the black market like they'd never existed. I sat there for hours trying to figure out a way out that didn't end with me losing everything or worse. The man with the beard, his name was Glenn, said they'd already offered him the buyout that morning, and he was planning to take it because he couldn't afford a legal battle, and his truck had a lien on it anyway. But my situation was different. I owned my 3 trucks outright, no loans, and one of them was sitting in this compound about to be stolen. If I signed it over, I'd lose not just that truck, but my entire business. I'd have nothing left. Around 3 in the morning, a different guard brought in sandwiches and bottles of water, and I noticed he propped the door open while he set the food down, just for a few seconds. Didn't even bother to check if we were all accounted for. That's when I realized something important. They weren't treating us like kidnapping victims because legally we weren't. We'd driven here voluntarily, we'd signed paperwork, and we were being fed and housed. If anyone asked, they'd say we were in a contractual dispute over equipment. They were sloppy because they didn't think we'd run. But I also noticed something else. The guard's radio was clipped to his belt and it was set to an open channel. I could hear dispatch chatter. and more importantly, I heard one of the guards say he was heading to the north gate to let a transport truck out. When the guard left and locked us back in, I told the others what I'd heard, and that I thought the north side of the property might be less monitored if they were focused on moving trucks out. Glenn said there was no point, that the fence was too high and the guards had weapons. But the younger guy, his name was Joey, said he'd noticed ventilation grates in the bathroom that connected to some kind of ductwork. It was a long shot, but we were all desperate in different ways. Around 4 in the morning, when we heard vehicle sounds and voices outside indicating another truck was being moved, Joey and I went into the bathroom and pried open the vent cover with a belt buckle. The duct was narrow, but not impossible. It took us maybe 20 minutes of crawling through sheet metal and insulation before we came out in what looked like a storage area on the opposite side of the building. From there, we found a loading door that wasn't fully secured, just held by a chain with enough gap to squeeze through. We ran across the lot, staying between the parked trucks for cover, and when we reached the fence line, we used one of the trucks as a ladder to climb up and carefully get past the razor wire, using our jackets as protection. I cut my arm pretty badly, and Joey twisted his ankle landing on the other side, but we were out. We ran through the woods until we hit that county highway, and then kept walking until we found a house with lights on about 2 miles down the road. The people who lived there were an elderly couple who let us use their phone to call the state police. What happened next took months to fully unfold, but the short version is that the police raided the property within hours of our call and found exactly what we described. 43 trucks, all reported stolen or missing over the past 8 months, all with altered VINs and forged documentation. They arrested 12 people on site, including the man in the polo shirt who turned out to be running the entire operation under multiple shell companies. Westline Logistics didn't exist as a legitimate business. It was just a website and a forwarding address. The FBI got involved because the operation crossed state lines and involved identity theft on a massive scale. They'd been using our driver's licenses and DOT numbers to create fake profiles, then using those profiles to secure loans and lines of credit before disappearing. Glenn and the other 2 drivers who were still in that room when the raid happened were released immediately. My truck was recovered, though it took 6 weeks of legal paperwork to get it back, and I had to replace the entire VN plate assembly because they'd already started the alteration process. I lost 2 months of income dealing with depositions and insurance claims, and I'm still paying off the legal fees. Joey got his rig back too, though his had already been partially stripped for parts. The thing that still keeps me up some nights is thinking about how many drivers might have just taken the buyout and walked away, never reporting it, never knowing they were part of something this big. I see posts sometimes on trucking forums, guys complaining about shady brokers or missing equipment, and I always wonder if they crossed paths with the same operation or one like it. I run my own loads now. No brokers, no overnight mystery runs, even if it means lower pay. Trust isn't something I give out easily anymore, and every time I see a truck sitting abandoned at a warehouse or a too-good-to-be-true load offer, I remember that fence and those rows of stolen rigs and how close I came to being just another driver who vanished. Driving refrigerated pharmaceuticals doesn't sound dangerous until you're the one responsible for keeping insulin stable at precisely 38 degrees while crossing a mountain pass in a blizzard. My commercial license renewal came through that January of 2015, which meant I'd turned 26 somewhere between the Utah border and that nightmare convoy through Teton Pass. I'd been hauling for Bridger Medical Transport for nearly 3 years by then, mostly solo routes, because the premium pay helped chip away at my mom's mounting medical bills from her botched knee replacement. The teaching credential I'd abandoned 2 years earlier felt like someone else's life entirely, especially on nights when I'd pull into a truck stop at 3 in the morning with my muscles aching and my thermos empty. But the job was mine, earned through countless hours of practice backing into tight loading docks and memorizing weight distribution charts that other drivers couldn't be bothered to learn. The convoy assignment came through dispatch on a Monday afternoon while I was finishing a delivery in Salt Lake. 6 refrigerated trucks needed to push medical supplies north to Billings before a massive winter system locked down the mountain routes for potentially a week. Bridger only organized convoys during severe weather advisories, when the risk of a solo driver getting stranded with a frozen load outweighed the inefficiency of coordinated travel. A veteran driver named Howard Pembroke got tapped as road captain, someone whose gravelly voice I'd heard countless times on the CB coordinating movements and warning about speed traps. When we staged at the truck stop in Logan that afternoon, Howard walked the line of rigs doing his safety check, a stocky man in his late 50s with wire-rimmed glasses that kept fogging up in the December cold. He stopped at my door, squinted up at my cab, and told me I'd be running sweep position at the rear of the convoy. His reasoning sounded solid enough at the time. My rig had the newest LED visibility array, and he wanted someone reliable watching for stragglers or mechanical failures. We rolled out just before sunset, which in December meant we'd be climbing into darkness by the time we hit the Sirius elevation. The convoy stretched ahead of me like a string of red taillights, each rig maintaining the mandatory 50-yard gap that Howard had drilled into us during the briefing. My CB crackled with periodic check-ins as we climbed, drivers calling out their positions and confirming their reefer units were holding temperature. The road was already getting bad, that kind of packed snow that turns to ice under your tires and makes every slight turn feel like a negotiation with physics. I kept my speed steady, my hands loose on the wheel the way my instructor had taught me during training, and tried not to think about the 16 pallets of insulin and antibiotics riding behind me. The pharmaceutical loads were always the worst for stress because you knew that somewhere down the line, actual human beings were counting on that shipment arriving intact and on schedule. About 40 minutes into the climb, one of the trucks near the front started having issues. I could hear it on the CB before I could see anything. A driver named Carl, reporting that his reefer unit was showing temperature fluctuations. Howard's voice came back immediately, calm and methodical, telling Carl to maintain speed and keep monitoring while he figured out if we needed to stop for a mechanical check. That's when I noticed the truck directly in front of me, a navy blue Freightliner with mud flaps that read Summit Freight, starting to tap its brakes more than necessary. Not the gentle pressure you'd use on a downhill grade, but these weird, irregular jabs that made the brake lights flare bright and then dim in a pattern that didn't match the road conditions. I clicked my CB to call it out, but before I could speak, Howard's voice filled the channel again, this time directing all drivers to tighten up the gaps because visibility was dropping fast with the snow coming down harder. The Summit freight truck hit its brakes hard about 10 minutes later, not a tap this time but a full stop that had me downshifting fast to avoid rear-ending him. My rig shuddered as I brought it down, the weight of the load pushing against my deceleration, and I watched the Freightliner's driver's side mirror as it swung wide and pulled off onto a narrow turnout carved into the rock face. The turnout wasn't marked as an official rest area, just a widened shoulder that maintenance crews probably used for equipment storage. Before I could process what was happening, the driver leaned out his window and waved me forward with these big, exaggerated arm movements like I was supposed to follow him in there. My gut told me to keep rolling, to click the CB and ask Howard what the protocol was for a truck-breaking convoy formation, but the Freightliner was completely blocking my lane now, and the shoulder was the only place with enough room to get around him safely. I pulled in, my headlights sweeping across the turnout and illuminating something that made my chest tighten. 2 more trucks were already parked there, tucked back against the rock wall in positions that suggested they'd been waiting rather than stopping for an emergency. Both were running, exhaust pluming white in the cold air, and as my rig came to a complete stop, a 3rd truck pulled in behind me, effectively boxing me into a space barely large enough for 4 rigs. The drivers emerged almost simultaneously, 3 men in heavy Carhartt jackets and insulated gloves, their faces ruddy from the cold, but their expressions hard and focused in a way that had nothing to do with weather concerns. The one from the Freightliner, a tall guy with a graying goatee, approached my driver's side while the other 2 flanked my passenger side and rear. I rolled my window down maybe 3 inches, enough to hear him but not enough to make myself vulnerable, and he immediately launched into an accusation that caught me completely off guard. He said I'd cut into his lane about 20 miles back, that I'd forced him to brake hard and nearly sent him into the guardrail. And that kind of reckless driving in convoy formation was exactly the type of thing that got people killed on mountain passes. I genuinely had no memory of cutting anyone off, and I told him so through the narrow gap in my window, keeping my voice level, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. He didn't seem interested in my explanation. Instead, he pulled out a small notepad, the kind drivers use to log fuel stops, and said that given the severity of the incident and the risk I'd posed to the entire convoy, he needed to see my key cargo certificate and manifest. His tone had shifted into something official sounding, like he was conducting a legitimate safety inspection. And when I hesitated, one of the other drivers, a shorter guy with a red face and a thick neck, moved closer to my passenger door and rapped his knuckles against the window. The sound was loud enough to make me jump. The tall one kept talking, saying that Summit Freight had contracted with Bridger before, and they knew the protocol for reporting unsafe drivers, that if I cooperated now, they could handle this between professionals without involving the highway patrol or my company's safety department. He wanted me to open the trailer for a visual inspection of my load, just to confirm I was maintaining proper temperature and hadn't compromised the shipment with my erratic driving. Everything about the request was wrong. Drivers don't inspect each other's loads on the side of the road, especially not in the middle of a blizzard on a mountain pass. Cargo certificates stay with the driver and only get shown to authorized personnel at weigh stations or delivery points. But I was alone, surrounded by 3 rigs and 4 men who clearly had coordinated this stop, and the wind was picking up in a way that made the temperature inside my cab drop every time it whistled through the window gap. I reached for my CB handset, intending to call Howard and report the situation, and that's when the tall driver did something that made the whole scene crystallize into focus. He reached up to his own shoulder mic, clicked it on, and broadcast over the convoy channel in this smooth, reasonable voice that there was a safety check in progress at mile marker 73, minor traffic incident being documented, and all other drivers should maintain course and speed to Billings. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Howard should continue leading the main group and not wait up because weather conditions were deteriorating fast. Howard's voice came back within seconds, acknowledging the message and confirming that the convoy would proceed as planned. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical weight. These men had access to the convoy frequency, knew the protocols well enough to mimic legitimate safety procedures, and had just successfully isolated me from any help using the very chain of command that was supposed to protect us. I sat there with the handset still in my grip, watching the tall driver's face through my partially open window, and saw the shift in his expression from pseudo-professional to something colder and more calculating. He told me they'd heard about a Bridger rig that had gone missing earlier that week, somewhere between Idaho and Wyoming, a full load of high-value pharmaceuticals that never made it to its destination and was currently listed as stolen in every law enforcement database from here to the Canadian border. His company, he said, had a client expecting a delivery that couldn't happen now because of that theft, and my manifest showed I was carrying exactly the kind of product mix that could substitute for what they'd lost. The math was simple. I could hand over my cargo certificate, open my trailer, and let them offload half my pallets to cover their shortage, or I could refuse and deal with the consequences of a formal safety violation report that would go directly to Bridger's compliance office. The threat wasn't even subtle. The red-faced driver moved around to my driver's side, standing close enough that I could see the water vapor from his breath fogging against my mirror. He laid out exactly what would happen if I didn't cooperate. They'd file a detailed incident report claiming I'd engaged in aggressive driving, failed to maintain proper following distance, and refused to allow a safety inspection of my refrigeration unit. They had dashboard camera footage, he said, or at least they'd claim to have it, and with 3 drivers willing to provide matching statements against my word alone, Bridger would have no choice but to suspend my license pending investigation. Even if I eventually got cleared, which could take months, I'd lose my current route assignments, my safety bonus, and any chance of getting premium pharmaceutical runs in the future. The tall one pulled out his phone, showed me a screen with what looked like a formal complaint form already partially filled out with my truck number and license plate, and said all it would take was one click to submit it through the industry safety reporting system. They knew I couldn't afford that kind of hit to my record, not with my mom's medical bills piling up and my entire income dependent on maintaining a clean driving history. My satellite phone was dead, battery drained from the cold after I'd forgotten to bring it inside during my last rest stop. The CB was useless now that they'd already established their narrative with Howard, and even if I could reach him, what was I supposed to say that wouldn't sound like excuses from a driver who'd legitimately screwed up? The wind was howling through the gap in my window, and I could feel the temperature in my cab dropping degree by degree, while these men stood outside in their insulated gear, perfectly comfortable waiting for me to brake. I looked past them at the wall of rock on one side and the steep drop on the other, both barely visible through the thickening snow. The third driver, who hadn't spoken yet, walked back to his truck and returned with a set of bolt cutters, not threatening me with them directly, but just holding them casually while he leaned against my trailer door. The message was clear. I could open it voluntarily, or they'd open it themselves and add destruction of property to their fictional incident report. My hands were shaking now, not from fear exactly, but from this sick combination of rage and helplessness that comes from knowing you're being robbed in slow motion and there's not a single person coming to help you. But then something shifted in my head, a moment of clarity that cut through the panic. These men were drivers, which meant they were on a schedule just like me, and this mountain pass was going to be completely impassable within the next few hours, based on the weather reports I'd checked before leaving Logan. They needed this done fast, which meant they were banking on me being too scared or too exhausted to call their bluff. I rolled my window down another inch, just enough to make eye contact with the tall one, and told him in the steadiest voice I could manage that I needed to see his operating authority number and his company's safety rating documentation before I'd even consider opening my trailer. It was a completely reasonable request under actual DOT regulations, the kind of thing any driver should be able to produce instantly if they're legitimately affiliated with a registered carrier. His face changed immediately, that professional mask slipping just enough for me to see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He started to respond, probably with another threat, but I cut him off and said I was also going to need the incident timestamped and location verified through the convoy's GPS coordination system, which Bridger monitored in real time for all pharmaceutical loads. That part was partially a bluff since I wasn't entirely sure how closely dispatch actually watched our GPS pings during active runs, but it was enough to plant doubt. The three men exchanged glances, and I watched the dynamic shift in real time. The red-faced one stepped back from my passenger door, his aggressive posture deflating slightly. The tall driver with the goatee tried to maintain control, launching into another explanation about how they were all registered carriers with Summit Freight, and this was standard procedure for convoy incidents. But his voice had lost that authoritative edge. I interrupted him again, louder this time, and said that if this was legitimate, then he wouldn't have any problem with me documenting everything on my dashboard camera and uploading it to Bridger's incident server before we proceeded. I didn't actually have a functioning dashboard camera. The mount had broken 2 months earlier, and I'd been too broke to replace it, but he had no way of knowing that. I reached for my sun visor like I was adjusting a camera angle and watched his face go through this rapid series of calculations. The wind hammered against my rig hard enough to rock it slightly, and I could see fresh snow accumulating on their shoulders and hoods at a rate that meant the pass was going to be undrivable within the hour. They were running out of time and they knew it. The tall one made one final attempt, his voice hardening as he said I was making a serious mistake by being uncooperative, that I clearly didn't understand how the industry worked or what happened to drivers who got reputations as troublemakers. But even as he said it, he was already backing toward his Freightliner, and the other two were moving toward their own rigs. The whole confrontation had lasted maybe 15 minutes, though it had felt like hours, and now they were retreating because the risk calculation had shifted against them. If I actually had cameras, if dispatch actually was monitoring my GPS closely, if I actually followed through on documenting their operating authority and filing my own report, then they'd be the ones facing scrutiny instead of me. The third driver with the bolt cutters tossed them into his cab and slammed the door without looking back. Within 2 minutes, All three trucks had fired up their engines, maneuvered out of the turnout in a chaos of reversing and repositioning that nearly put one of them into the ditch, and disappeared up the mountain road ahead of me. I sat there alone in the turnout with my engine idling, and my whole body shaking from adrenaline dump, watching their taillights fade into the white curtain of snow until there was nothing left but the howling wind and the knowledge that I'd just barely avoided something that could have destroyed everything I'd worked for. I waited another 5 minutes to make sure they were really gone, then pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the pass at maybe 20 miles per hour. My hands welded to the steering wheel and my mind replaying every moment of that encounter on an endless loop. I never saw those trucks again, never heard their voices on the CB, and when I finally rolled into the Billings distribution center 8 hours later, exhausted and wired and still half convinced they might be waiting for me somewhere, my load was intact, and my manifest was clean, and nobody at Bridger ever knew how close they'd come to losing an entire shipment to a coordinated theft, disguised as a safety check. When you spend most nights alone on the interstate, you start to see things differently. I'd been hauling refrigerated freight for almost a year back then, running long stretches through the Midwest. My routine was simple: music low, thermos of coffee within reach, and a habit of counting mile markers to stay awake. That night the sky was heavy with clouds, no moon at all, and the air felt damp like it might rain. I was between loads, heading toward an industrial park to pick up medical supplies scheduled for early morning delivery. Everything about the drive felt ordinary until I saw the figure standing on the shoulder, waving both arms. At first I thought it was a trick of the headlights, but the shape didn't move away. I slowed and saw a young woman in jeans and a gray hoodie, hair sticking to her face from the wind. She looked terrified, eyes darting toward the trees like she expected someone to come out of them. I pulled onto the gravel, keeping the rig's hazards flashing, and she ran up to the door before I could even roll the window down. "Please, my car died," she said, voice cracking. She was shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Against better judgment, I unlocked the passenger side and let her in to warm up. She smelled faintly of diesel and some sharp chemical scent I couldn't place. While I dialed for roadside assistance, she kept thanking me, saying most drivers just sped past. Her name, she said, was Tara. She worked part-time at a lab in the city and had been driving back after a late shift when her car broke down. I believed her. She looked exhausted, pale under the dash light. We made small talk about night driving, gas prices, the weather, but every few seconds she glanced toward the console where my dispatch papers sat. I didn't think much of it until she quietly slipped one folded sheet into her jacket pocket. I caught the motion in the corner of my eye. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked. She froze for a split second, then laughed it off, saying she thought the paper was hers. I didn't push it, I just wanted to drop her at the next safe spot. A few miles later, I pulled into a way station that was closed for the night. Lights on, nobody there. The moment I stopped, she changed. Her polite tone vanished. "I can't get out," she said flatly. "Not yet." Then she reached into her bag and took out 2 small vials wrapped in gauze. "I need to deliver these. It's urgent. 2 exits ahead." At first I thought she was joking. I told her there was no way I was driving anywhere without knowing what was inside those vials. She pressed her thumb against one of the labels, and I saw the print blur. It wasn't even sealed properly. "They're medical samples," she said, eyes locked on mine. "Just fluids, nothing dangerous, I swear." I told her I'd call a tow truck for her car, and maybe she could explain everything to the cops when they showed up. That's when her whole demeanor shifted. She unzipped her hoodie and pulled out her phone, flipping the screen toward me. It showed a map of my route, my carrier name, and my home address in bold letters. She must have noticed how I looked at the screen because she smiled, not the friendly kind. "You're not really in a position to say no," she said softly. "You're marked as the driver on this load. If I make one call, your log shows tampering, maybe even cargo interference." My throat tightened. I asked her how she got that information, and she told me there were people who monitored sympathetic drivers. those who picked up strangers, offered rides, or helped stranded motorists. "You're exactly who we look for," she said. "Decent, predictable." The words made me feel smaller with each syllable. She started explaining things I didn't want to know. How courier rings moved unregistered biomedical material between private labs. How sometimes they lost couriers, so they used helpers, regular drivers, unaware at first, then pressured later. She said those who refused were blacklisted. "It's easy," she went on. "All they have to do is file a report. One ELD discrepancy, one missing scan, and your company dumps you." She said it like she'd done it before. I remember gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, trying to keep my breathing steady. I told her to get out. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back and crossed her arms like she owned the cab. The only sound was the hum of the refrigeration unit outside. My hazard lights blinked red across her face every few seconds, like a metronome counting down. I tried reasoning, told her she could walk, that I wouldn't tell anyone. She said she'd already sent messages to her people, sharing my truck number and location. "You can't disappear," she added quietly. "You drive on public roads. You leave a trail every day." For the first time in my life, I wished the way station wasn't so empty. I sat there for what felt like forever, headlights sweeping past from the highway now and then, each one briefly lighting her face. I knew if I panicked, I'd lose control of the situation completely. So I did the only thing I could think of. I played along. I told her fine, I'd take her 2 exits down. I turned the rig back on, pretending to adjust the GPS, but I was actually opening the camera app on my phone, trying to record without her noticing. She kept checking her messages, whispering under her breath like someone was giving her directions. I merged back onto the highway, my pulse so loud it drowned out the engine. When we reached the next exit, she pointed toward a narrow frontage road that cut behind a cluster of old warehouses. The lights ahead were dim and yellow, flickering like they hadn't been replaced in years. "There," she said, and I could see a black SUV idling by a dumpster, no plates visible. I slowed down but didn't stop completely. Instead, I told her the brakes were acting up and that I needed to roll forward a bit before I parked. As soon as she looked toward the windshield, I hit the air horn, long and loud. The SUV's headlights flashed, and whoever was inside backed away fast, startled. In that instant, she yelled at me to stop, but I threw the truck into gear and kept going. She screamed something about ruining everything, but I barely heard her. A few miles down, I pulled into a brightly lit rest stop where a couple of other drivers were parked. She tried to open the door, but the handle jammed, child lock still on. I shouted for one of the guys outside to call the police. When she realized people were watching, she stopped shouting and went eerily calm, tucking the vials back into her jacket like nothing had happened. By the time the state trooper arrived, she'd changed her story again, said I'd offered to smuggle things for her and then turned on her. But I had the video, even if it was shaky and half dark. They took her away after checking her ID. Apparently it didn't match any real record. The trooper told me to keep my doors locked and file a report with my company immediately. For weeks after, I expected someone to call, or for those people to show up at a fuel stop somewhere, but nothing ever came of it. The company said there was no record of any complaint, no sign anyone had tried to access my ELD logs. Still, I changed routes and never stopped for anyone again. Sometimes late at night when I pass an empty shoulder, I think about that first glimpse of her under the headlights. I used to think helping strangers made the road a little less lonely. Now, I just keep driving. I've been driving long-haul routes for nearly 15 years, mostly through the Midwest. Back then, I had a habit of stopping at the same small rest area off I-70. Nothing big, just 2 gas pumps, a diner with 5 booths, and a vending machine that always ate my quarters. The kind of place you remember because it breaks up the monotony of endless miles. I'd been there maybe a dozen times over the years, enough for the waitress to start recognizing me. Her name was Lila, I think, red hair tied up with a pencil, and that habit of humming old country tunes while refilling coffee. That week started like any other. I left St. Clair County before dawn, planning to make it to Denver by nightfall. Around mid-morning, I reached the exit where the rest stop always sat. The big blue sign that used to say, "Fuel, Food, Restrooms" was gone. At first, I thought maybe construction crews were redoing the entrance, but when I pulled in, the asphalt was cracked and overgrown. The gas station canopy still stood, but the pumps were missing entirely, just metal stubs jutting from concrete like broken teeth. I parked the truck, got out, and stood there for a minute trying to piece it together. The diner windows were boarded up from the inside. The menu sign faded into a ghost of its old self. No tire marks, no trash, no evidence anyone had been there in months. Even the air felt still, like the whole place had been vacuum sealed. I walked around back, half expecting to find a closed for renovation notice, but there wasn't a trace. Just silence and wind whistling through an empty ice freezer. Confused, I decided to stop at the next town a few miles down the highway. I pulled into a small diner off Main Street, grabbed a coffee, and asked the lady behind the counter what happened to the rest area down the road. She looked at me like I'd asked about a dream. Said she'd lived there her whole life and never heard of any rest stop near that exit. When I tried explaining where it used to be, she laughed softly and said maybe I was mixing it up with somewhere else. But I knew that stretch of road like the back of my hand. I couldn't shake the weirdness. After finishing my coffee, I went back to the truck and pulled up my GPS history. Sure enough, it showed multiple stops at those same coordinates over the years. I even remembered refueling there last time, just a few months earlier. I had a receipt from the gas pump tucked in my logbook. When I checked, it was still there. The station's name, a timestamp, even the same exit number. But when I tried looking up the company online, there wasn't a single record of it. No listing, no business registration, nothing on Google Maps, just a blank spot surrounded by farmland. That night, parked at a truck stop outside Hayes, I started scrolling through old dashcam footage. It took a while, but I found a clip from a previous trip, clear as day, pulling into that exact rest area. You could see the diner's red neon sign flickering, a guy in coveralls fueling up his pickup, and that same blue logo on the gas canopy. But when I paused the frame and zoomed in, something about the background bothered me. There weren't any highway signs visible, no mile markers, no exit numbers, just darkness beyond the lot, like the whole thing existed in its own pocket of space. The next morning, I called the state highway department, hoping maybe it had been shut down for safety reasons. The operator checked their database and said there were only 2 official rest areas along that section of I-70, and neither matched the one I described. She even emailed me a map to prove it. I mentioned the receipt, but she said counterfeit branding isn't unheard of, and that I should contact the state police if I thought something shady was involved. That word, counterfeit, stuck with me the rest of the drive. So later that afternoon, I stopped by a patrol office off the interstate. The officer on duty, Sergeant Hill, listened to my story without interrupting. When I showed him the receipt and dashcam clip, he leaned closer to the screen, his expression tightening. He asked me to forward the footage to a specific email, then told me quietly that I wasn't the first driver to bring up a disappearing rest area. Apparently, others had reported similar locations. Fake truck stops popping up overnight, built by organized groups trying to skim electronic logs and cargo manifests from long-haul rigs. Sergeant Hill explained that the setup was sophisticated. These groups would scout quiet stretches of interstate, rent or buy old lots, and reconstruct fake rest stops with stolen signage and used equipment. They even installed dummy fuel pumps wired to hidden devices that read ELD ports when drivers connected for receipts or Wi-Fi. It looked legitimate enough. Logos, uniforms, receipts, everything. Then, when they had enough data, they'd target certain trucks carrying high-value cargo. By the time police got wind of it, the entire operation would vanish overnight, dismantled piece by piece before dawn. When I asked how they could pull it off without anyone noticing, he said they used stolen construction permits and unregistered trucks, working mostly after midnight. Locals thought it was state maintenance or contractors putting up a new facility. By the time daylight came, it looked like a normal, open rest stop. Then one night they'd load everything back up and disappear, leaving only concrete and weeds. Hill said they'd raided a few similar sites before, but most were wiped clean before evidence teams arrived. Driving home later that week, I passed that same exit again. I slowed down, staring at the empty lot, and for a second, I swore I saw faint tire tracks leading into the grass. Not fresh, but not completely gone either. The diner's outline was still visible under the dust, like a ghost shadow of where it once stood. I didn't stop. I just kept rolling west, the silence in the cab louder than the hum of the engine. I couldn't stop thinking about how many other places like that might still be out there, waiting for another driver to pull in. I've kept that receipt ever since, tucked in my glove compartment. The logo's faded now, the ink bleeding from heat and time, but it's proof, at least to me, that the place existed. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe I was one of the last people to ever see it before it disappeared for good. Either way, I don't stop anywhere that isn't on an official highway list anymore. You learn to trust your instincts on the road, but after that day I also learned to trust the map more than my memory. Name's Aaron Mitchell, and for the last few years I've run a refrigerated rig hauling boxed beef and poultry into grocery chain distribution docks. Life on the road turned into a routine I could manage. Pre-trip at dawn, coffee that tastes like cardboard, and the white noise of the reefer humming behind me like a generator in a distant room. Bills got paid, mileage stacked up, and I kept my head down. That particular morning began like any other. Clean BOL, seal number noted. Temperatures steady at set point. The air carried that cold, metallic smell when you crack the trailer doors a sliver to check frost on the chute. Nothing exotic about the route, nothing unusual about dispatch. Still, a thought kept pinging the back of my mind. The last 2 drops had shown weights a little lighter than what I'd scanned. Not a huge gap, just enough to raise an eyebrow. The seal on today's load looked fine at first glance, same color, same serial format. But the crimp had a tiny burr, like someone closed it with a tool that didn't belong to it. My notes from prior runs showed a different style of crimp entirely. Inside the trailer, the air felt too crisp for the temp reading on the unit. The probe said one number, my breath said another. The data line on the ELD recorded a short stop the night before, at a location I didn't recognize, just a code where a city tag usually lives. Dispatch brushed it off as a ping glitch when I called, telling me to make my window and quit worrying. I kept rolling toward the first dock, repeating the seal number out loud, trying to anchor it in my head. Little things matter with a reefer, weights, temps, seals, and today the little things didn't quite line up. At the distribution yard, I backed into a door next to another reefer rig I'd seen on this route a handful of times. The driver climbed down, Caleb Foster, mid-30s, ball cap with a frayed brim, the kind of guy who keeps his gloves clipped to his belt so he never loses them. We traded quick hellos while the dock light went red. He mentioned his paperwork showed a shrink on the last run that didn't match what he'd scanned. I joked about ghost pallets, and he didn't laugh. When his turn came to open up, he pointed at his seal. Same color as mine, same serial style, same odd burr on the crimp. We compared BOLs right there on the bumper, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the trailer. His recorded gross and my recorded gross were mirror images, like someone swapped items between 2 nearly identical loads. We pulled our ELD temp graphs and laid the phones side by side on the dock plate. Both showed a tiny temperature ripple around the same time overnight. Less than a degree, barely a hiccup, but visible if you knew how to read the slope. His log, like mine, had that mysterious stop code with no location tag, sandwiched between miles that should have been continuous. The receiving clerk called out that my door was going green, but I held back. If we swung the doors and something didn't match, it would be on us. We asked for a supervisor and requested a witnessed break of the seal with a scale ticket at the dock. The clerk frowned, made a call, and came back with a new tone in his voice. "You two wait here." The dock light stayed stubbornly red, and the hum of the building felt suddenly louder, like we'd stepped into a machine that just noticed us. After nearly 20 minutes, a man in a reflective vest appeared, clipboard in hand, with a tight expression like someone who'd just stepped into a problem he didn't want. He asked for our paperwork. then told us both to stay put while he made a few calls. Through the window, I watched him talk to a warehouse manager and another guy in a collared shirt with no badge, just a visitor pass clipped sideways. They kept glancing at our trucks like we were part of something bigger than a missing pallet. The other drivers unloading around us looked uneasy. One muttered that corporate had been running new suppliers lately. Nobody seemed to know where those suppliers were based. When they finally broke the seals under witness, the trailer smelled wrong. Not spoiled exactly, just metallic and sharp, the way a slaughterhouse alley does on a humid day. The boxes near the back looked fine, but halfway in, markings started to change. Some cartons had inked stamps that didn't match USDA print specs. One even had the font misaligned. Caleb's load showed the same irregularities. We filmed what we could before being told to stop. The warehouse manager's voice turned clipped, asking if we'd tampered with anything. He mentioned the possibility of contamination reports. I could tell the tone had shifted from concern to accusation. We were told to park and wait for further instructions. No one said who would be giving them. By late afternoon, a couple of unmarked sedans pulled up, and two men in suits started photographing both rigs, including license plates. One of them asked if I'd signed for my seals personally, as if I'd forged them myself. Caleb tried to reason with them, explaining how dispatch assigned the loads sealed and documented. They barely acknowledged him. Within an hour, we were escorted off the dock, told the loads were being held pending inspection. My company called soon after, flat tone, corporate speak, saying all deliveries for that supplier were temporarily suspended. 2 days later, the story broke on a regional news site. Drivers accused in meat tampering scandal, the headline said, with our truck numbers blurred just enough to avoid legal risk, but clear enough for anyone who knew us to recognize. The article claimed an investigation uncovered uninspected product distributed through unauthorized channels, tied to unlicensed slaughterhouses posing as USDA-certified facilities. The kicker was that the logistics company, our employer, collapsed almost overnight. Website offline, dispatch phones disconnected, payroll frozen. The whole thing vanished like it had never existed. Caleb texted me that night. We were just delivery hands. How do we end up the villains? The following week, state inspectors reached out for statements. They wanted to know when I'd first noticed irregularities, who had loaded the trailers, and whether I'd seen any third-party tags. I told them everything, the mismatched seals, the off readings, the duplicate stops on the logs. They listened, nodded, and promised follow-up. But the official report that came out later barely mentioned the drivers. It framed the entire thing as logistical oversight, implying we'd missed standard checks. No mention of counterfeit suppliers, no acknowledgement that the dispatch system had been rerouting data to fake coordinates. They needed scapegoats to make the story neat for the evening news, and two haulers fit the role perfectly. Caleb tried to find a lawyer, but every firm he contacted dropped him once they realized how messy the case was. I filed unemployment and waited for someone to tell me what came next. Weeks passed in silence. Every time I heard a reefer unit start up on a passing truck, it felt like a reminder of how quickly something ordinary can turn into evidence. One afternoon, a man in plain clothes came by my apartment with a card that had no department name, just a phone number. He set off the record that investigators had traced the missing product to warehouse shells leased under fake business names. The people behind it had scrubbed their trail so clean that even the leasing agents didn't know who paid them. Months later, I started hauling again for a smaller outfit, sticking mostly to regional runs. I still check every seal twice, compare serials to the log, and avoid night pickups whenever possible. Sometimes I think about how easy it was for an entire operation to exist in plain sight, using drivers like me as camouflage. Those counterfeit seals were the perfect disguise, small, ordinary details that no one questions until the numbers stop adding up. I kept one of them, the one from that last run, sealed in a plastic bag inside my glove box. A reminder that trust on the road isn't guaranteed, not even from the company whose name is painted on your trailer. I've told this story a few times, mostly to rookies at truck stops who think the scariest part of the job is fatigue or bad weather. They laugh until they realize how quiet the industry gets when something like this happens. The truth is, the most dangerous thing out here isn't what's on the road. It's what hides behind paperwork that looks official. I used to think I understood the business I worked in. Now, every manifest feels like a mystery waiting to unfold, one barcode at a time.